Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've been hesitating to write this down for almost 9 years now. I'm not sure why today is the day I finally decided to share what happened. But maybe it's because I'm getting older and don't want this experience to die with me. I spent 32 years as a forest ranger in Washington State before retiring, and I've seen just about everything the wilderness can throw at a person. Or so I thought. This happened in October of 2014. I had planned a 5-day solo backpacking trip in the North Cascades near Ross Lake. It's remote country, jagged peaks and old-growth forests that stretch for miles. The kind of pristine wilderness that's getting harder to find. Being early October, I knew the weather could turn, but the forecast looked decent. Cold, but manageable. I'd hiked these mountains my entire career and felt completely at home there. The first couple days were uneventful. Foggy, cold, but peaceful. The kind of solitude I'd been craving since retirement. I'd settled into that rhythm you find on longer hikes. Wake up with the sun, hike until mid-afternoon, set up camp, eat, sleep, repeat. By the third day, I'd made it about 16 miles in, following game trails and occasional markers. I found a beautiful spot near some ancient cedars to set up camp. Some of those trees must have been there since before European settlers arrived. The ground was soft with pine needles, and there was a small stream about 50 yards away for water. I remember setting up my tent, gathering firewood, and cooking a simple dinner of dehydrated chili. The fog had lifted a bit that afternoon, giving me some decent views of the surrounding peaks. I felt completely at peace. It was getting dark early, so by 7 p.m., I was already in my sleeping bag, reading a bit by headlamp, before turning in. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Now, wilderness silence isn't like city silence. There's always something making noise, wind in the trees, birds, small animals rustling around. But this was different. It was like everything just stopped. No wind, no animals, nothing. The hair on my arm stood up, and I turned off my headlamp to listen better. That's when I heard it. 3 distinct knocks, like someone hitting a tree trunk with a baseball bat. Thump, thump, thump. They echoed through the still air, and I could tell they were coming from somewhere down the ridge to the east, maybe half a mile away. I've heard all kinds of things in the woods at night, but this was deliberate, rhythmic. I sat up in my sleeping bag, fully alert now. About 2 minutes passed, and then a 4th knock came. This one was much closer, maybe only 100 yards away. My mouth went dry. In all my years as a ranger, I'd heard stories from hunters and hikers about tree knocks. They were usually associated with one thing, but I'd always dismissed those stories as campfire tales. I told myself it was probably just a branch falling or some animal behavior I wasn't familiar with. But deep down, I knew better. Whatever made that sound was communicating. I decided to stay put in my tent. Making a run for it in the dark would be foolish, and I had my bear spray and a good knife if it was a predator of some kind. I checked my watch. It was just after 11 p.m. For about an hour, nothing happened. The forest remained eerily silent. I was starting to think I'd overreacted when I heard the first footstep. It was heavy. Not like a deer or even a bear. It was the sound of something with significant weight, carefully placing its foot on the forest floor. Then another step, and another. Slow, methodical footfalls that seemed to be circling my campsite. What really got to me was the pattern. It would take several steps from one direction, then stop completely. A minute would pass, and then the steps would resume from a different angle. Whatever it was deliberately circling my camp, pausing to observe, then moving again. This wasn't natural animal behavior. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I fumbled for my flashlight but decided against turning it on. Some instinct told me that would be a mistake. The footsteps continued their pattern for about 20 minutes. Circle, pause, circle, pause. They never came closer than about 50 feet from my tent, but they never went further away either. Just this methodical perimeter walk, and then they stopped altogether. The silence was so complete I could hear my own pulse in my ears. I was sitting perfectly still, barely breathing. That's when I caught movement from the corner of my eye. Something dark shifting against the slightly less dark background of the trees. I slowly turned my head toward the movement and saw it. Even now, I struggle to describe what I saw. It was a silhouette just beyond the tree line, maybe 60 feet away. The moon was behind clouds, but there was just enough ambient light to make out its shape. It was tall, impossibly tall. I'm 6'1", and this thing stood at least 8 feet, maybe more. Its proportions were humanoid, but wrong somehow. Arms hanging unusually low, almost to the knees. The shoulders were massive. The head appeared to sit directly on them with little or no neck. It swayed slightly, the way a person does when standing still for a long time. I could see steam coming from where its mouth would be as it breathed in the cold night air. I was frozen, not out of some rational choice, but pure primal fear. This was something ancient, something that didn't belong in our world as we understand it. I knew, looking at that silhouette, that I was seeing something few people ever see. And those who do rarely report it for fear of ridicule. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than a minute, it made a sound. A deep grunt that seemed to come from its chest rather than its throat. Not aggressive, not a warning, more like acknowledgement. The sound vibrated through my chest, even at that distance. Then it did something that still haunts me. It reached up, way up, and grabbed a branch of one of those old cedars. It wasn't a casual movement, it was deliberate, a demonstration. It pulled the branch down slowly, held it for a moment, then let it go. The branch didn't snap back quickly like it would if I had done it. Instead, it returned to position slowly, like the creature was controlling its movement the entire time. I understood the message. I could break you just as easily. Without warning, it then turned and walked away. Not crashing through the underbrush like you'd expect from something that size, but swiftly and almost silently. Within seconds, it had vanished into the darkness. I didn't sleep, not even for a minute. I sat there, knife in one hand, bear spray in the other, until the first hint of dawn touched the sky. My body ached from being tense for so many hours, and I was shivering, though more from fear than cold. As soon as there was enough light to see, I cautiously exited my tent. The morning was quiet, normal. Birds were chirping again. If it weren't for what I was about to discover, I might have convinced myself I had experienced some sort of waking nightmare. About 20 feet from my tent, heading toward where I'd seen the figure, I found the first footprint. My breath caught in my throat. It was enormous, easily 18 inches long and proportionally wide. It was a bare foot, 5 toes clearly visible but not human. The impression was deep, suggesting something of tremendous weight. The stride length between prints was over 4 feet. I followed the tracks, both the set coming toward my camp and another set leading away. They led to a young tree, maybe 6 inches in diameter. What I saw there made me pack up immediately. The tree had been twisted, not broken, twisted, until the trunk split. The top half was hanging by a few wood fibers. No animal could do that. No human could do that. It took immense, purposeful strength. I didn't bother with breakfast. I stuffed everything haphazardly into my pack and started hiking out. My planned route would have taken 2 more days, but I covered it in one frantic march, barely stopping to rest or eat. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the underbrush made me jump. I felt watch the entire time, though I never saw the creature again. When I finally reached my truck, My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I drove straight home, 6 hours without stopping. I never told this story publicly. Who would believe a retired ranger claiming to have encountered a Sasquatch? But I did confide in a few former colleagues I trusted. What surprised me wasn't that some believed me immediately. It was that several of them nodded knowingly and then shared similar experiences they'd had over the years. Things they'd seen or heard in remote areas that defied explanation. Instances where they felt watched or followed by something that stayed just out of sight. We all agreed on one thing. There are places in those mountains where even experienced outdoorsmen should never go alone. Territories that belong to something else, something that's been there long before us and will remain long after we're gone. I've never returned to that particular area, though I still hike in other parts of the Cascades. But I'm never alone anymore. And I never stay after dark if I can help it. Sometimes, when I'm in the woods and that unnatural silence falls, I'll turn and head back, no matter how far I've come. Because now I know what that silence means, and I have no desire for a second encounter with whatever watches from the shadows of the North Cascades. Story 2. I haven't talked about this much since it happened. To be honest, I still don't know what to make of it, and I'm worried people will think I'm crazy. But I need to get this off my chest because it's been eating at me for years now. This happened back in early June of 2011. My son Brady was 7 at the time, and we were headed out to my cousin Rick's place about 25 miles outside Yazoo City, Mississippi. Rick had broken his leg in a four-wheeler accident the weekend before, so I'd volunteered to help feed his horses for a couple weeks while he recovered. It was a warm afternoon, somewhere between 4 and 5 o'clock. The kind of Mississippi afternoon where the humidity makes everything feel heavier than it should. Brady was excited about seeing the horses, chattering away in the passenger seat of my old Ford F-150 about which one was his favorite. I remember he had chocolate ice cream stains on his Little League t-shirt from earlier that day. I decided to take this shortcut I knew, a gravel road that runs alongside some railroad tracks. Not many people use it, but it cuts about 15 minutes off the trip. The road isn't maintained very well, all loose gravel and potholes, but I'd driven it enough times to know where the bad spots were. My truck bounced along as dust clouds billowed behind us. We just passed this big frozen food warehouse, you know, one of those industrial buildings that sits out in the middle of nowhere. There's a small intersection there where another dirt road crosses. I think the warehouse used to be something else years ago, but now it's where they store frozen food before shipping it out to grocery stores across the state. Most of the time, the place looks deserted except for the occasional semi-truck. Brady was telling me about some video game he wanted when it happened. I still replay those few seconds in my mind at least once a week. We weren't going very fast, maybe 30 miles an hour, when this thing just launched itself across the entire width of the road. 1 second the road was clear, the next, this creature was sailing through the air right in front of my truck. I slammed on the brakes so hard that Brady jerked forward against his seatbelt. The truck skidded on the gravel, and I swear we came within 2 feet, maybe even less, of hitting it. I remember that distinct feeling of the ABS brakes pulsing under my foot and the sound of gravel spraying as we slid. What I saw doesn't make sense, even now. This wasn't a deer, it wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I've ever seen in these woods, and I've been hunting since I was 12. This thing was huge. I'm not exaggerating when I say it had to be at least 8 feet tall. It cleared the entire width of the road, which has to be at least 15 feet across, in a single bound. It didn't touch the road surface at all. It was like it jumped from one side of the roadside vegetation and sailed completely over to the other side. The strangest part was its hair. It had this reddish-brown hair covering its body, maybe 4 to 6 inches long. But it wasn't thick like animal fur. It moved differently, more like human hair that was blowing in the wind as it leapt. I'd never seen anything like it. The color was so distinct, like a rusty cinnamon shade, not black or dark brown like you'd expect from a bear. Its body was lean but incredibly muscular. I remember seeing the muscles flex as it soared across the road, but the arms, God, the arms were all wrong. They were way too long for its body, hanging down like an orangutan's. But this wasn't any kind of ape or monkey I'd ever seen pictures of, not even close. Brady screamed, "Dad!" right as I was braking. I think the sudden stop scared him more than what we saw, because it happened so fast. I'm not even sure how much of it he actually processed, but I saw it clear as day, and the image is burned into my brain. After the creature landed on the other side, it took just one step into the tall grass and disappeared, just gone. 1 minute this massive thing was there, the next it had vanished into the vegetation. There were railroad tracks beyond that, then a mix of open farmland and patches of woods. I sat there with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. I couldn't move. The truck engine was still running and Brady was asking what happened, but I just stared at the spot where it had disappeared. "Dad, what was that? Was it a deer?" Brady asked, but I couldn't answer him right away. After a minute, I managed to pull the truck over to the side of the road. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely turn the steering wheel. "Stay in the truck," I told Brady. I didn't want him getting out, but I had to see if there was any sign of the thing. I grabbed the small mag light I keep in the glove compartment and stepped out. The gravel crunched under my boots as I walked to where I thought it had landed. The grass on that side of the road was nearly waist high, a mix of Johnson grass and those tall weeds that grow wild in the summer. I stood at the edge of the road, scanning the area. The vegetation was disturbed where something large had obviously pushed through, but the trail seemed to end about 10 feet in. It was like whatever made it had either changed direction or, I don't know, just vanished. I didn't dare go further into the grass. Something in my gut told me that would be a terrible idea. Instead, I listened. The usual sounds of birds and insects had returned. A train whistle blew in the distance. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary anymore, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Brady rolled down his window. "Dad, can we go? I don't like it here." I hurried back to the truck and locked the doors. My heart was still racing. "Yeah, buddy, we're going." As I pulled back onto the road, I kept checking the mirrors and scanning the roadside, half expecting to see it again. Brady must have picked up on my tension because he stayed quiet for the next few miles, which wasn't like him at all. When we got to Rick's place, I was still so shaken, I almost forgot why we'd come out there in the first place. I went through the motions of feeding the horses, but my mind was elsewhere. I kept looking over my shoulder at the tree line behind the barn. On the drive back, I took the main highway, even though it was longer. There was no way I was going back down that same gravel road, especially with darkness coming on. Brady fell asleep in the passenger seat, but I was wide awake, replaying what I'd seen over and over. That night, after Brady was in bed, I sat at the kitchen table with a beer and tried to make sense of it all. I've hunted these woods my entire life. I know every animal that's supposed to live here. This wasn't a bear standing up. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't a person in some kind of suit. No human could move like that or clear that distance in a single bound. I considered calling the sheriff's department, but stopped myself. What would I say? That I saw some giant hairy creature leap across the road? They'd think I was drunk or making it up. The next morning, I almost convinced myself it had been a trick of the light, maybe a deer that somehow looked bigger than it was. But I know what I saw. The image was too clear, too detailed to be anything but real. A few days later, I worked up the courage to drive back out there alone. I parked near the warehouse and walked along the road looking for any signs, broken branches, unusual tracks, anything. But a heavy rain had come through, washing away whatever evidence might have been there. I went into the gas station on the edge of town, the one where all the local hunters hang out, and carefully brought up the subject of strange sightings in the area. Most of them laughed or told stories about panthers that people claimed to see but weren't supposed to be in Mississippi anymore. Then, old Jim Ferris, who's lived in Yazoo County his entire 70-plus years, got real quiet. After the others had moved on to talking about fishing, he leaned over to me. "Where exactly did you see this thing?" he asked in a low voice. I told him about the road by the warehouse, and he nodded slowly. "My daddy used to talk about something in those woods. Back in the 50s, railroad workers would report seeing a tall creature watching them from the tree line. They called it Red Man because of its color." He shook his head. "I always thought it was just stories to scare kids away from playing on the tracks." I asked if anyone had seen it recently, and Jim shrugged. "People don't talk about such things anymore. They're afraid of being laughed at. But every few years, someone comes in here with that same look you got, like they've seen something they can't explain, and it's eating them up inside." In the weeks that followed, I became obsessed. I searched online for similar sightings around Yazoo City and found surprisingly little. A few vague reports on obscure websites, nothing substantial. But I did find patterns of sightings across the South, northern Louisiana, parts of Arkansas, and throughout Mississippi, of tall, red-haired creatures moving with impossible speed. I never told my wife the full story. I just said we'd nearly hit a deer, which was enough to explain why I was shaken up that day. Brady, thankfully, seems to have either not seen it clearly or has filed it away as some animal we nearly hit. Kids are resilient that way. Sometimes I wonder if he remembers anything about it at all. But I remember. I remember the impossible length of those arms, the way it moved, so fluid and powerful like nothing I've ever seen, the reddish-brown hair that wasn't quite fur but wasn't human hair either. The intelligence I sensed in that split-second encounter. I've driven that road many times since, always in daylight, always with a loaded shotgun in my truck. I've never seen it again, but sometimes when I pass that warehouse, I get a feeling, like I'm being observed from the tree line along the railroad tracks. What bothers me most isn't just what I saw, but what it means. If something like that exists, living undetected so close to where people work and live, what else might be out there that we don't know about? I think about that warehouse sometimes. It makes sense now. A creature like that would be drawn to a place where it might scavenge for food. I've heard from Rick that workers there occasionally report trash containers being disturbed overnight, though they usually blame it on bears or raccoons. Last summer, almost a year after our sighting, there was a story in the local paper about unusual tracks found by the railroad. The article dismissed them as a prank, but the photo showed something that looked nothing like a human footprint, too large, with the wrong proportions. I cut that article out and kept it. I think about going public with what I saw, but I know how it would go. People would think I was crazy or attention-seeking. My reputation in town would be ruined, so I've kept quiet, telling only a few trusted friends who won't judge me. But I know what I saw that day on that gravel road outside Yazoo City. Something that shouldn't exist, but does. Something fast enough to clear 15 feet in a single bound and disappear without a trace. Something intelligent enough to avoid detection for decades, perhaps centuries. Sometimes when I'm driving those back roads alone, I find myself slowing down near the areas with tall grass, part of me afraid of seeing it again. Another part desperately hoping for confirmation that I'm not crazy. Brady's 14 now, and recently he asked me out of the blue if I remembered that weird day when we went to feed Rick's horses. When I asked what he meant by weird, he said, "That day we almost hit something, and you got out to look for it. You were acting strange. I just told him it was a close call with a deer, and he seemed to accept that. But sometimes, I wonder if he saw more than he lets on. That thing is still out there. I'm sure of it. Moving silently through the woods, watching from a distance, crossing those gravel roads when it thinks no one is around. I just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or maybe the right place at the right time. depending on how you look at it. I still take the main highway to Rick's place. I probably always will. Story 3. I've been hunting since I was a kid. My dad taught me, just like I've been teaching my boy Caleb. November 2002 was when everything I thought I knew about these woods got turned upside down. We were heading into Gifford-Pinchot National Forest near Trout Lake in Washington. Been hunting deer there for years. It's always been good to us. I knew a perfect spot, small meadow with a creek running through it, surrounded by dense forest. The deer love moving through there. I'd been taking Caleb hunting since he was 12, but this was our first serious trip since he turned 16. He was so excited to finally be treated like an equal hunting partner instead of just Dad's sidekick. We parked at an old logging road and hiked about 3 miles in to reach our spot. The weather was crisp, but not too cold. Perfect hunting weather. I remember checking my watch when we arrived at the campsite, just after 2 in the afternoon. Plenty of time to set up before dark. Something felt off almost immediately. Caleb noticed it too, which surprised me. "Dad, it's really quiet," he said as we were unpacking. At first, I didn't pay much attention. Sometimes it gets quiet in the woods, especially when humans show up. But as the afternoon wore on, the silence became impossible to ignore. No birds, no squirrels chattering, no frogs by the creek, nothing. I've spent thousands of hours in forests all over the Pacific Northwest, and I've never heard such complete silence. It wasn't peaceful, it was wrong, like the woods were holding their breath. We set up the tent, arranged our gear, and prepared a small fire pit. All the while, I kept waiting for the normal forest sounds to return. They never did. As darkness fell, I expected to hear owls or coyotes. Nothing. Not even the creek seemed to make noise as it flowed past our camp. "Is it always this quiet when you come here?" Caleb asked as we cooked dinner over the fire. "No," I answered honestly. "Something spooked the wildlife." "Bears?" he asked. "Maybe," I said, but I didn't believe it. Bears don't silence entire sections of forest like this. We turned in early that night. The plan was to be up before dawn to catch the morning deer movement. I remember lying awake, staring at the tent ceiling, listening for anything, wind in the trees, an animal call, anything. All I heard was Caleb's breathing as he fell asleep. The next morning was just as unnervingly quiet. We grabbed our rifles and some basic gear and headed deeper into the forest to scout. I've tracked deer my whole life. What we found was bizarre. Fresh deer sign everywhere. Fresh tracks crossing trails. Fresh scat. Trees freshly rubbed by bucks, but not a single actual deer. In spots that should have been crawling with deer, we found only evidence they'd been there very recently and then suddenly vanished. "Dad, look at this," Caleb called from nearby. He was pointing to a set of deer tracks that showed clear signs of animals running, not just moving, but sprinting in panic. The tracks disappeared into a thicket, but what struck me was how many different tracks there were, all fleeing in the same direction, like something had scattered an entire herd. "Something scared them off," I said, examining the ground. "Recently, too. These are from this morning." "What scares deer like that?" Caleb asked. "Wolves." "Wolves would leave tracks," I replied, scanning the area, "and we'd hear them howling." We spent the entire day moving through our hunting area, finding the same pattern everywhere. Abundant sign, no animals. By late afternoon, I was frustrated and increasingly uneasy. We returned to camp with nothing to show for our efforts. That night, we sat by the fire eating the freeze-dried meals we'd packed. The silence remained unbroken, except for our own voices, which seemed unnaturally loud. I noticed Caleb kept looking over his shoulder into the darkness beyond our campfire. "What's up?" I asked him. "I don't know," he said, shaking his head. "Just feels like we're being watched." I'd been feeling the same thing, but hadn't wanted to make him nervous. "Probably just the dark playing tricks," I said, trying to sound reassuring. I added more wood to the fire, building it up higher than I normally would. We stayed up late talking about school, his plans for college, Normal father-son stuff. It felt good to connect with him. Around 11, we finally crawled into our sleeping bags. I placed my hunting rifle within easy reach, something I don't usually do. Call it instinct. I don't know exactly what time it was when I woke up. The fire had burned down to embers that cast a faint red glow across our campsite. Something had pulled me from sleep, a sound maybe, or just that feeling you get when something's wrong. I checked my watch. It was just after midnight. That's when I heard it. A long, deep howl from somewhere in the forest to the west of our camp. It started low, then rose in pitch, lasting maybe 15 seconds before ending in this strange vocal crack I can't really describe. It wasn't a wolf or a coyote. I know those sounds by heart. This was something else entirely, deeper, more powerful. It raised every hair on my body. Before I could even process what I'd heard, another howl answered from the eastern side of the meadow, closer to us, much closer. Caleb sat bolt upright in his sleeping bag. "Dad?" His voice was barely a whisper. "I hear it," I said, already reaching for my rifle. "Stay quiet." That's when we heard the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate steps moving through the underbrush at the edge of the meadow, breaking branches, not trying to be stealthy. Whatever it was big, and it didn't care if we heard it coming. The steps circled toward the back of our campsite where we had set up our cooking area. I heard our metal cooler suddenly scrape across the ground, then a loud crash as it was knocked over. Food packages rustled. I fumbled for my flashlight, clicked it on, and pointed it toward the sound. What I saw standing there is burned into my memory so deeply, I'll never forget it as long as I live. It was massive. Standing just beyond our dead fire pit was something that looked like a man, but wasn't a man. It stood nearly 9 feet tall, with shoulders as broad as a linebacker's, maybe broader. Its arms hung down past its knees, muscular and covered in matted fur that looked grey-brown in my flashlight beam. Its head seemed almost too small for its body, set low between those powerful shoulders. When my light hit it, it turned and looked directly at us. Its eyes caught the light and reflected back a dull orange glow, like a predator's. The face, God, the face. It was like a cross between a human and an ape, but not exactly either. A heavy brow ridge shadowed those eyes, and its nose was flat and wide. For maybe 5 seconds we just stared at each other. Me, Caleb, and this creature. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. My finger was on the trigger of my rifle, but I couldn't even lift it. Something primal in me knew that shooting would make things worse. Then it made this sound, a low, rumbling growl that I felt more than heard. It vibrated through the ground into my bones. It turned slightly, never taking its eyes off us, and slammed one massive arm against a nearby tree with such force, I heard the bark crack. Not a full swing, just a casual, effortless blow that could have shattered a man's skull. Message received. After that display, it simply turned and walked away into the darkness. Its gait was smooth, fluid, unnervingly silent for something so large. Not lumbering like a bear or awkward like a man in a costume, it moved like an athlete, disappearing into the tree line in seconds. "Dad." Caleb's voice was shaking. "What the fuck was that?" "I don't know," I said honestly. My mouth was so dry I could barely form the words. "But we're staying right here until daylight." Neither of us slept, not even close. Throughout the night we heard it moving around our camp, never showing itself again but making sure we knew it was there. Branches snapping, heavy breathing, low, gravelly rumbles. At one point, something heavy dragged across the roof of our tent, not tearing it, just touching it. I had my rifle aimed at the tent wall the whole time, finger trembling on the trigger. The sounds circled us all night, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but never truly leaving. I kept thinking about how that thing had just casually knocked over our cooler, 60 pounds when fully loaded, like it was nothing. When the first grey light of dawn finally crept into the sky, the forest fell truly silent for the first time. No movement, no breathing, nothing. We waited another hour before I worked up the courage to unzip the tent and look outside. Our campsite had been rearranged. The cooler had been thrown clear across the meadow, at least 20 feet away. It was dented on one side, like someone had punched it. Our backpacks had been moved from where we'd left them, stacked in a neat pile near a tree. One of the trees at the edge of our site had deep scratch marks running from about 7 feet high down to about 4 feet, like something had raked huge fingers down the bark. But most disturbing were the footprints. Enormous prints pressed deep into the soft earth around our site. I put my boot next to one. My size 12 was dwarfed. These prints were at least 20 inches long and maybe 5 inches wide. They clearly showed 5 toes, no claw marks. Human-like, but not human. Caleb was taking pictures with his camera. Smart kid. I was too stunned to think of it. "Dad, look at this," he said, pointing to a series of the prints. They showed a clear path where the creature had paced back and forth at the edge of our camp all night long, just outside the radius of light from our fire, watching us. We packed in complete silence, constantly scanning the woods around us. Neither of us wanted to turn our back on the forest for even a second. We didn't bother with breakfast or coffee. We just needed to get out. The hike back to the truck was the longest 3 miles of my life. Several times we heard movement paralleling our trail, branches breaking just out of sight. Something was escorting us out of its territory. We hiked faster than I thought possible while carrying full gear. When we finally reached the truck, I actually cried in relief. I'm not ashamed to admit it. We threw our gear in the back and I peeled out of there, spraying gravel. We were 20 miles away before either of us spoke. "We're not telling Mum about this, are we?" Caleb finally asked. "No," I agreed. "She wouldn't want either of us in the woods ever again." When we got home, I cleaned my rifle methodically, checked it thoroughly, then locked it in the gun safe. I sat for a long time, just staring at the closed safe door, thinking about how I'd never once fired a shot, how something deep inside me had known that shooting would have been the worst mistake of my life. A week later, Caleb asked me a question I'd been dreading. "Are we going back next year?" I looked him straight in the eye. "No," I said, "not ever again." I've only told this story once before to my buddy Mike, who's been hunting those woods almost as long as I have. When I finished, he got real quiet, then said, "I had something scream at me in those woods 20 years ago. Never told anybody, but I never went back either. I still hunt, but never alone, and never in Gifford Pinchot. I've spent countless hours researching what we saw that night. I know what people will say, that it was a bear, or my imagination, or a hoax. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. That feeling of being in the presence of something ancient and powerful that viewed us as intruders." The pictures Caleb took that morning disappeared. The roll of film came back from developing completely blank, except for shots taken before and after our trip. The camera worked fine on later trips. Sometimes I wake up hearing that howl, that vocal crack at the end that wasn't quite human, wasn't quite animal. When I do, I lie awake wondering how many other hunters have encountered something similar in those remote forests. How many never told their stories out of fear of ridicule. How many, like me, simply decided some places are better left alone. I don't know what it was that watched us all night in that silent forest, but it knew we were there. It could have hurt us at any time, but it didn't. It just wanted us gone. I think about those huge footprints circling our tent while we sat terrified inside. I think about how deliberately it announced itself to us instead of attacking without warning, almost like it was giving us a chance to leave peacefully. We took that chance, and I'll never stop being grateful that we did. Nasom. Story 4. I've debated whether to share this for 26 years now. My friends have encouraged me to put it out there, but honestly, I was afraid of the ridicule. I'm 62 now and figure what's the point of keeping it to myself anymore? I need to tell someone who might understand or have seen something similar. It was early spring of 1997, probably mid-April. I'm Jackson Miller, and I was fishing with my two buddies, Devon Carter and Lucas Wright, at Table Rock Lake down in southern Missouri. We'd been planning this trip for months, just three guys in their mid-30s escaping the daily grind for some fishing and beers. We launched Devon's bass boat around 7:30 that morning. It was one of those perfect spring days. Clear blue sky, maybe 65 degrees, with just enough breeze to keep the bugs away, but not enough to mess with our fishing. We started working our way along the shoreline near Leatherwood Creek, which, if you know the area, has some prime fishing spots. By around 9 in the morning, we'd caught a few decent-sized bass. Nothing amazing, but we were having a good time. Devon was handling the trolling motor while I was up front and Lucas was in the back. We were moving slowly, maybe 20 yards from each other, each focused on our own lines. The shoreline in that area transitions from this really dense, almost jungle-like forest to a clearing where some power lines cut through. The power company keeps that area clear, so there's this stretch of exposed rocky terrain before it goes back to thick woods. We were trolling parallel to this shoreline, I'd say about 50 yards out, just far enough that we could cast toward the bank, but still see a good stretch of the shore. I remember I had just reeled in my line to change lures when I noticed something moving on shore. At first, my brain just registered it as something walking without really processing what I was seeing. But then it fully registered, and I froze with the lure halfway attached to my line. There was this figure moving across the rocks in the clearing, walking upright like a person would, but immediately I knew it wasn't a person. The entire body was covered in what looked like hair or fur, a brownish, reddish color that almost blended with the surroundings, but distinct enough against the gray rocks. "Hey," I said, not even looking at my buddies. "You guys seen this?" Devon had already stopped the trolling motor. "What the hell is that?" he whispered, even though there was no way whatever it was could hear us from that distance. The three of us just stood there, watching this thing walk from the tree line, across the rocky clearing, heading toward the other section of forest. It wasn't particularly tall, maybe around 5 feet if I had to guess, but its proportions were all wrong for a human. Its arms were noticeably longer than they should be, swinging in this fluid but odd way as it walked. It moved with this strange, slightly hunched posture, but what struck me most was how comfortable it seemed, navigating the uneven rock terrain, like it knew exactly where to place each foot without looking down. It was moving methodically, deliberately, not rushing but not hesitant either. "Are you filming this?" Lucas whispered urgently. "With what? It's 1997, man. Who brings a video camera fishing?" Devon shot back, not taking his eyes off the shore. I wish we'd had something to record it with. The whole sighting probably lasted less than a minute as our boat slowly drifted. But in that minute I noticed details that have stayed burned in my memory. The way its knees bent slightly different than a human's, the strange proportions of its torso compared to its limbs, the way its head sat directly on its shoulders with almost no visible neck. I can't describe the face in detail. We were too far away, and it never turned directly toward us. But there was something sharp about its features, angular and wrong in a way I can't properly explain. Not like an ape's face, more like a caricature of a human face drawn by someone who'd never actually seen one. What stands out most in my memory is how utterly unconcerned it was. It never looked our way, never seemed to notice or care about our boat. It just continued its path across the rocks and disappeared into the tree line on the other side of the clearing. The three of us sat in complete silence for what felt like forever after it vanished. Finally, Devon restarted the trolling motor. "What the fuck was that?" Lucas finally said, his voice shaking slightly. "I don't know," I replied. My hands were trembling so badly I couldn't finish attaching my lure. "Bear," Devon suggested, but even he didn't sound convinced. "Maybe walking on its hind legs." "Bears don't walk like that," I said. "Not for that long and not that smoothly." "Could have been someone in a costume," Lucas offered. "Out here, miles from any road access, wearing what would have to be a professional movie-quality costume to navigate those rocks." Devon shook his head. "No way." We debated turning around to look for tracks or other evidence, but something stopped us. A sort of unspoken agreement that we didn't want to get any closer to whatever we'd just witnessed. Instead, we continued fishing, but our hearts weren't in it anymore. We kept glancing at the shoreline, scanning the trees. Around noon, we packed up and headed back much earlier than planned. The whole drive home, we tried to rationalize what we'd seen. Maybe it was a hunter in some kind of ghillie suit. Maybe it was a bear, and the distance and angle had distorted our perception. Maybe it was just some homeless guy living in the woods who hadn't bathed or shaved in years. But deep down, we all knew those explanations didn't fit what we'd seen. After we got home, we made a pact not to tell anyone for a while. We were all established professionals in our community. Devon was a dentist, Lucas worked at the bank, and I ran a successful construction business. The last thing any of us needed was to become those crazy guys who saw Bigfoot. A week later, I broke down and told my wife. She listened patiently, asked a few questions, and then said, "I believe you saw something, Jack. I just don't know what it was." That was as much validation as I was going to get, and honestly, it was enough. The three of us would bring it up occasionally when we were alone, comparing our memories, checking for inconsistencies. But our accounts remained remarkably consistent over the years. Sometimes I'd wonder if we'd collectively imagined the whole thing. But then Devon would mention some small detail, like how the creature's hair seemed to have a slight wave to it in the breeze. And I'd remember seeing the exact same thing. About 5 years after the incident, Lucas moved to Colorado for work, but Devon and I stayed in Missouri. We'd still fish Table Rock Lake, but we always avoided Leatherwood Creek. I can't explain why exactly. It wasn't fear so much as respect, like we'd glimpsed something we weren't supposed to see, and it felt wrong to intrude again. In 2012, Devon was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. During one of my visits to him in hospice, when the morphine had loosened his usual reserve, he brought up our sighting. "You know what still bugs me about that thing we saw?" he asked, his voice thin and raspy. "What's that?" I sat forward in the uncomfortable plastic chair beside his bed. "It knew we were there, it had to. We weren't being quiet. That boat motor, even the electric one, makes noise. 3 guys talking. It knew we were watching, Jack. It just didn't care." That observation haunted me after Devon passed. He was right. Whatever we saw that day showed no concern about being observed by humans, and that suggested a level of intelligence and confidence that made the whole encounter even more unsettling. Last year, I finally got back in touch with Lucas. We hadn't spoken much over the years, just the occasional Christmas card or social media comment. But when we got on the phone, it was like no time had passed. Within 10 minutes, he brought up Leatherwood Creek. "I've been doing some research," he said. "There have been other sightings around Table Rock. Not a ton, but enough to make me think we weren't crazy." "What kind of sightings?" I asked. "Similar to ours, small, hairy bipeds. Not the 8-foot monsters you hear about in the Pacific Northwest. More human-sized. Some people call them Missouri Momo or something." I did my own research after that call. Lucas was right. There were other reports, though most were dismissed as folklore or misidentifications. But a few accounts described something strikingly similar to what we'd seen. The proportions, the movement, that strange angularity to the face. I went back to Table Rock Lake alone last spring, 25 years after our sighting. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not even my wife. I rented a small fishing boat and made my way to Leatherwood Creek around the same time of year we'd been there before. The landscape had changed somewhat. New development along parts of the lake. The power line clearing was wider than I remembered. But as I approached the spot where we'd seen the creature, a powerful sense of being watched washed over me. I scanned the shoreline, the trees, the rocky clearing. Nothing moved except the wind through the leaves. I cut the engine and let the boat drift, just as we had that day. The silence was almost oppressive. No birds calling, no insects buzzing, just the gentle lap of water against the hull. I don't know what I expected to happen, but after 20 minutes of drifting, I started the motor and left. I haven't been back since. I'm not claiming what we saw was definitively a Bigfoot or Sasquatch or whatever you want to call it. I'm just sharing what 3 sober, rational men witnessed in broad daylight on an ordinary spring morning. Something that moved like a human, but wasn't human. Something that navigated difficult terrain with ease. Something that didn't belong in our understanding of the natural world. Devon took whatever final conclusions he drew to his grave. Lucas has embraced the paranormal explanation, joining online forums and research groups. Me, I'm still not sure, but I know what I saw, and 26 years later, I still can't explain it. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, walking confidently across those rocks, unconcerned with who might be watching. And sometimes, usually when I'm just about to fall asleep, I remember that sharp, angular face, and I find myself hoping I never get a closer look. When people ask me if I believe in Bigfoot, I usually just shrug and change the subject, because how do you explain that what you believe doesn't matter when you know what you saw? How do you convey the absolute certainty that for less than a minute on an April morning in 1997, 3 ordinary men glimpsed something extraordinary? You can't. So mostly, I don't try. But I know what I saw at Leatherwood Creek, and whatever it was saw us too. It just didn't care. Story 5. I've sat on this experience for 13 years now. I'm not the type to share personal stories online, but I need to get this off my chest. My friends and I have talked about it privately over the years, but we've never told the full story publicly. I guess I'm hoping someone might have experienced something similar and can help make sense of what happened to us. Back in May of 2010, 4 of us, me, Alan, my girlfriend Miranda, and our friends Damien and Jen, decided to do a weekend hiking trip in Coleville National Forest in Washington State. We were all in our early 30s, experienced hikers who'd been on plenty of overnight trips before. Nothing fancy, just regular people who enjoyed getting away from city life. We chose Sullivan Lake because none of us had been there before, and the area was supposed to be beautiful but not heavily trafficked. The forest there is incredibly dense. Tall pines, firs, and tamaracks that block out the sun in places. It's proper wilderness, the kind where you can hike for hours without seeing another person. The weather forecast looked good that weekend. Mild temperatures, no rain. We packed light, but brought everything we needed. 2 tents, sleeping bags, a small cooler with some beers and food that needed to stay cold, plus our regular hiking supplies. We arrived at the trailhead around noon on Saturday, parked our cars, and headed out. The first day was honestly great. We hiked about 7 miles into the forest, following a trail that gradually climbed into the hills. The weather held up perfectly, warm enough to be comfortable in light jackets, cool enough that we weren't sweating too much. We saw some deer in the distance, a couple of hawks circling overhead, normal forest stuff. By late afternoon, we found a perfect spot to make camp, a small grassy hollow near a creek where we could get fresh water. The site was maybe 50 yards from the trail, in a little clearing surrounded by tall pines. We set up our tents, gathered firewood, and got a decent campfire going. We cooked dinner on Damien's portable stove, drank a few beers, and just talked and laughed like we always did. Around 10 that night, we decided to turn in. Miranda and I shared one tent, while Damien and Jen took the other. We didn't think anything of it at the time, but I remember looking up at the stars before getting into my tent and feeling how utterly quiet it was. No wind, no animal sounds, just complete stillness. It should have been peaceful, but something about it felt off. I fell asleep quickly enough, but I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. My phone was in airplane mode to save battery, but I checked the time. It was around 2 in the morning. What woke me was a sound I couldn't quite place at first. It was rhythmic, like someone hitting something solid with a branch or a rock. 3 distinct thumps, then silence for maybe 30 seconds, then 3 more. The sound was distant at first, but it was loud enough that it carried through the still night air. I nudged Miranda, but she just mumbled something and rolled over. I lay there for maybe 20 minutes just listening to this strange thumping pattern. 3 hits, pause, 3 hits, pause. It didn't sound like any animal I knew of. After a while, the thumping stopped. I was just starting to relax when I heard something else. Movement in the forest beyond our little clearing. Heavy movement, not like a deer or even a regular black bear. This was something large moving deliberately through the underbrush. Branches were snapping underfoot, but not in a frantic way. It sounded controlled, almost careful. I sat up in my sleeping bag, fully awake now. Miranda stirred beside me. "What is it?" she whispered. "I don't know," I whispered back. "Something out there." The sounds grew closer, circling our campsite. Whatever it was big, and it was moving around us, not just passing by. I could hear it on one side of our camp, then minutes later on the opposite side. It wasn't rushing, just methodically moving around our perimeter. I reached for my flashlight but hesitated. Part of me didn't want to know what was out there. After about an hour of this, I heard Damien whispering from their tent, "Alan, you awake? You hearing this?" "Yeah," I whispered back. "What do you think it is?" "No idea, but it's big." We fell silent as the movement came closer to our tents. I could hear heavy breathing now, not panting like a dog, but deep, rhythmic breaths from something with massive lungs. Then a smell hit me, musky and wild, like wet fur and something else I couldn't identify. Not like the skunky smell of a bear, something different. The fire had died down to embers hours ago, but there was enough moonlight to see shadows. Something moved near what remained of our fire pit. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to see. I unzipped the tent just enough to peer out, trying to be as quiet as possible. What I saw still haunts me. Standing beside our fire pit was a massive figure. In the dim light, I couldn't make out details, but what I could see was unmistakable. It stood upright on 2 legs, at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. It had a massive, bulky frame covered in what looked like dark hair, either dark brown or black. I couldn't tell in the moonlight. What struck me most was its proportions. Its shoulders were incredibly wide, and its arms hung down almost to its knees. Its head seemed to sit directly on those shoulders, like it barely had a neck at all. The creature was looking down at our fire pit, moving what looked like charred sticks around with one hand, almost like it was curious about them. I held my breath, paralyzed with fear. Then it turned. It didn't turn its head. Its whole body pivoted in one motion toward our tent. I dropped the zipper and fell back, trying not to make a sound. "What is it?" Miranda whispered, her voice trembling. I put a finger to my lips, unable to answer. I didn't have words for what I'd just seen. It wasn't a bear standing up. It wasn't a person in a costume. It was something else entirely. For what felt like hours, we lay there listening to this thing move around our camp. It wasn't aggressive. That's what was so strange. It seemed to be investigating our stuff. I heard it pick up something metal, probably our cooking pot, and set it down. Then there was the sound of one of our packs being moved, followed by a low, rumbling sound that wasn't quite a growl. It was deeper, almost like a grumble of curiosity. "Alan," Damien whispered from the other tent. "What the hell is that?" "I don't know," I whispered back. "Just stay still." At one point I heard the cooler being moved, then a cracking sound, like plastic breaking. The creature made that rumbling sound again, louder this time. I was terrified it would come for our tents next, but it didn't. Instead, after what must have been at least 2 hours, we heard heavy footsteps moving away from our camp, heading toward the ridge behind us. None of us slept after that. We lay awake, listening for any sounds of return, whispering theories about what it could have been. A bear? No way. Mountain lion? Definitely not. Person playing a prank? Out here? Miles from anything? Not likely. When the first light of dawn finally came, we waited another hour before cautiously emerging from our tents. What we found confirmed that it hadn't been a dream or a case of night terrors. The area around our camp was disturbed in a way that made my skin crawl. One of our packs, Jen's, had been torn open, its contents scattered but nothing taken. Our cooler had been flipped over, its plastic lid cracked clean through. But what really shook me were the footprints. In the soft ground near the creek and around our campsite were huge, human-like footprints. Not bear tracks, not prints from any animal I've ever seen. These were shaped like a human foot, but massive, easily 19 or 20 inches long with visible toes. They were deeply pressed into the ground, suggesting whatever made them was incredibly heavy. We were all standing there, trying to process what we were seeing when we heard it. From the ridge above our camp came a sharp crack, the unmistakable sound of a tree branch breaking, then a loud, echoing whoop that didn't sound like any animal call I've ever heard. It was powerful enough that it seemed to vibrate the air around us. We didn't even discuss it. We started shoving everything into our packs, not caring about organization or even if everything fit properly. Within minutes, we had torn down the tents and were ready to go. No breakfast, no coffee, nothing. Just a desperate need to get out of there. We hit the trail hard, moving as fast as we could back toward the trailhead. That's when the weirdest part started. As we hiked, I became aware of movement in the forest to our left, parallel to the trail. Something was keeping pace with us, always just out of sight in the dense trees. "Do you hear that?" Miranda whispered, gripping my arm. I nodded. We all heard it, heavy footsteps moving alongside us, matching our pace. Occasionally, we'd hear a branch snap or leaves rustle. Once, a rock landed about 20 feet into the forest to our right. Not thrown at us, but thrown so we would hear it land, like it was letting us know it was still there. This continued for almost the entire hike out. Whatever it was followed us for miles, always staying hidden but making just enough noise that we knew it was there. Damien wanted to stop and try to get a photo, but Jen and Miranda refused, and honestly, I was with them. I just wanted to get back to the cars. About a mile from the trailhead, the presence suddenly stopped. The parallel movement, the occasional sounds, they just ceased. We paused briefly, listening, but heard nothing. It was as if whatever had been following us had decided we'd reached some invisible boundary and turned back. We practically ran the last mile. When we finally reached our cars, we threw our gear in the trunks and stood there, all of us breathing hard, a mix of physical exertion and lingering fear. "That wasn't a bear," I finally said, voicing what we'd all been thinking. No one disagreed. We drove straight through to Seattle without stopping except for gas, barely talking during the drive. Each of us was lost in our own thoughts, trying to make sense of what we'd experienced. In the years since, we've discussed it many times among ourselves. We've researched, looked up similar encounters, and tried to find rational explanations. None of us has ever gone public with this story until now. Was it a Sasquatch? I don't know. I was never a believer in that kind of thing before, and I'm still not sure what to think. All I know is what I saw and what we all experienced. Something massive, bipedal, and clearly intelligent encountered us that night. It was territorial, but not aggressive. It didn't want to harm us. It seemed more curious than anything, but it definitely wanted us to know we were in its space, and it escorted us out of its territory. The thing that sticks with me most isn't the fear, though there was plenty of that. It's the sense that whatever we encountered was aware, it had purpose and intention. It wasn't just an animal acting on instinct, it was watching us, studying us, maybe even communicating with us in its own way. I don't have answers, just an experience I can't explain. I still go hiking, but I've never been back to that part of Coleville, and I never will. Some places belong to others, and that forest, whatever lives in it, made it clear we were just visitors passing through its domain. Story 6. I never planned to tell this story, but I've been carrying it for so long, and after finding this community and reading other experiences, I finally feel like someone might believe me. This happened in early spring of 1991, and I still think about it several times a week, even all these years later. I was 18 back then, just a kid really, working a forestry job near Bearden, Arkansas. Small town, lots of woods, not much else. The kind of place where everybody knows everybody and outsiders stick out like a sore thumb. My job was pretty straightforward, marking boundary lines for timber companies, clearing brush so other guys could come through and paint the markers. It wasn't glamorous work, but I liked being outdoors, and it paid decent money for a teenager. That particular day started like any other. I remember it was chilly that morning. Not cold enough for frost, but I could see my breath when I first got out of my truck. I'd packed a simple lunch, peanut butter sandwich, an apple, and a thermos of coffee. I wore my usual work clothes, sturdy boots, jeans, a flannel shirt, and a bright orange safety vest. Standard stuff for working in the woods during hunting season. I'd been assigned to work a section near some railroad tracks that cut through the forest. The tracks weren't used much anymore, maybe 1 or 2 trains a day at most, but they provided a good landmark and made it easier to navigate between work areas. My truck was parked just off a dirt access road about a half-mile from where I was working. The day went by pretty normally. I cleared brush, checked my compass readings, made some notes on my worksheet. Around 4 in the afternoon, I decided to pack it in for the day. The light was still good, but I had finished my section, and I wanted to get back to town before dark. I gathered my tools, machete, clipboard, compass, water bottle, and started walking back along the railroad tracks toward my truck. I remember feeling satisfied with my day's work, kind of whistling to myself as I walked. The tracks ran straight through a corridor of trees that had been cut back about 30 feet on each side. It was peaceful, just the sound of gravel crunching under my boots and birds calling in the trees. I'd walked maybe a quarter mile when I first noticed something standing at the next crossing ahead. At first, I thought it was just a person. Maybe another worker or a local out hunting, but something about the silhouette immediately felt wrong. It was tall, way too tall. There were crossing signs at this intersection where a dirt road crossed the tracks. Standard railroad signs that stand about 8 feet high. This, whatever it was taller than those signs. I'm not exaggerating when I say it had to be at least 9 feet tall, maybe more. My brain immediately tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was someone standing on something, but no, it was clearly just standing there on the tracks. I slowed my pace, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. There was an older guy who lived in the area that sometimes walked along the tracks wearing a silver hard hat and white shirt. A retired railroad worker, I think. But this wasn't him, not even close. As I got a bit closer, still keeping a good distance, maybe 100 yards away, I could see more details. The figure was dark, almost black, but with some lighter patches. It wasn't wearing clothes as far as I could tell. It stood completely upright, not hunched over like you'd expect from someone that tall. Its proportions were all wrong for a human. The arms seemed longer, hanging lower than they should. The most disturbing thing happened when it turned to look in my direction. Instead of just turning its head like a person would, it rotated its entire upper body, like it couldn't move its neck independently. That simple movement sent a chill through me that I can still feel today when I think about it. There was something so profoundly unnatural about that motion. I froze in place. Fight or flight kicked in, but I couldn't do either. I just stood there staring. The figure was bulky, solid-looking, not thin or lanky, but powerful. I remember thinking it looked like a bodybuilder who'd somehow grown to giant size, with a thickness to its chest and shoulders that didn't match any human I'd ever seen. We stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably just a few seconds. Then it took one step toward me, just one, but that was enough. My heart started hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't even think about running. My legs had turned to concrete. What happened next probably saved me from a heart attack at 18. A logging truck on the nearby road suddenly revved its engine, that distinctive diesel roar echoing through the trees. The noise seemed to startle the figure as much as it startled me. It quickly turned, again, that whole body rotation, and stepped off the tracks into the woods. Here's what I'll never forget. It covered ground in a way that defied logic. 2 strides, just 2 enormous steps, and it disappeared into the tree line. The distance it covered would have taken me 5 or 6 good strides at a full run. It moved with purpose but not panic, like it simply decided it was time to leave and did so efficiently. I stood there, unable to move, for I don't know how long. Maybe a minute, maybe 10. When I finally got my legs working again, I didn't run. I walked very deliberately, keeping my eyes fixed on where it had disappeared into the woods. Some primal part of my brain told me not to run, that running would trigger something, make me pray. The walk back to my truck was the longest of my life. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure emerge from the trees. When I finally reached my truck, my hands were shaking so badly I dropped my keys twice before managing to unlock the door. I didn't tell anyone about it right away. Who would believe me? A 9-foot-tall whatever it was, standing on railroad tracks in rural Arkansas. I'd sound crazy, but about a week later, I was having beers with my friend Tommy, whose grandfather owned property near where I'd been working. After a few drinks, I cautiously mentioned seeing something weird on the tracks. Tommy gave me this look, not disbelief, but recognition. He told me his grandfather had been complaining for years about something large visiting his property at night. According to Tommy, his grandpa had seen a huge bipedal creature going through his trash cans multiple times. Once, it had even approached his back porch and peered through a window. Tommy said his grandpa described it as somewhat like a monkey, but not quite. The weird thing was, his grandfather never seemed particularly afraid of these encounters. He treated them like you would a nuisance animal, annoying but not threatening. When I asked why his grandfather had never reported it or told more people, Tommy just shrugged and said, who'd believe him? Besides, it never hurt nobody. That conversation changed how I thought about what I'd seen. It wasn't just a random encounter. There was history there, a pattern. These things, whatever they were, had been around the Bearden area for a long time, coexisting with the locals in a strange, uneasy relationship. I worked that forestry job for another 3 months, and I never went back to that section of tracks alone. When I had to work nearby, I'd make excuses to team up with other workers. I never saw the figure again, but I felt watched whenever I was in those woods. Not in a threatening way necessarily, just observed. The memory of that day has stayed with me for over 30 years now. I've tried to convince myself it was just a very tall person, maybe someone playing a prank. But I know what I saw. The height, the proportions, the way it moved, none of it was human. What bothers me most isn't the fear I felt that day. It's the realization that there are things in this world that exist just outside our everyday awareness. Things that have probably been there all along, watching us, while we go about our lives oblivious to their presence. I've never gone public with this story until now. I moved away from Bearden a few years after the incident, went to college, got a normal job in the city. Sometimes I wonder if that's why I left. Not for better opportunities, but to get away from those woods and the knowledge of what lives there. For those who might be wondering, yes, I've heard of Bigfoot and Sasquatch. I've watched the TV shows and read the articles. Some of the descriptions match what I saw, but many don't. The figure I encountered wasn't hairy all over like they usually describe. It had dark skin with patches, more like a gorilla than the typical Bigfoot depiction. And that neck thing, I've never heard anyone else mention a Sasquatch that couldn't turn its head independently. I don't know what to call what I saw that day. I don't know if it has a name. What I do know is that it was real, it was intelligent, and it was aware of me in the same way I was aware of it. There was recognition in that encounter, a mutual acknowledgement of each other's existence. Sometimes I think about going back to Bearden, finding Tommy, asking if his grandfather is still alive, and if those creatures still visit his property. But another part of me doesn't want to know. Some mysteries might be better left unexplored. I still work outdoors occasionally, camping, hiking, fishing, but I never go alone anymore. And whenever I find myself near railroad tracks cutting through forests, I can't help but slow down and scan the horizon, half expecting to see that tall, dark figure standing upright, watching me with that unnatural stillness. It's been 32 years, and I still sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, convinced I've heard something large moving outside my window. On those nights, I lie perfectly still, listening, remembering the way that figure turned its entire upper body to look at me, and I wonder if it remembers me too. Story 7. I've been putting off writing this for years now, even though I've thought about that day at least once a week since it happened. It's been nearly 18 years, but I still get this weird tightness in my chest whenever I think about those tracks in the sand. I've never been the type to believe in monsters or cryptids or whatever you want to call them, but what my son and I found that day in November 2006 has haunted me ever since. My name's Martin. I'm a lifelong Montanan, grew up near Helena, and I've spent most of my life fishing and hunting around Canyon Ferry Lake. Nothing special about me, just a regular guy who works construction, loves the outdoors, and tries to be a good dad. My boy Drew was 14 at the time, going through that typical teenage phase where he'd rather be playing video games than hanging out with his old man. But I'd managed to convince him to come arrowhead hunting with me that day. It was unseasonably warm for early November, probably mid-50s, and we'd had a really dry fall. The water levels at Canyon Ferry were the lowest I'd seen in years, exposing shoreline that's usually underwater. Perfect conditions for finding arrowheads or other Native American artifacts that might have washed up. Drew wasn't exactly thrilled about the expedition, but I'd promised him pizza afterward, which was usually enough to get him outdoors. We brought along our terrier, Max, this scrappy little Jack Russell, who was about 5 years old then and full of energy. That dog was fearless. He'd chase after deer 3 times his size if I let him, which is why I always kept him on a leash in the woods. But once we got to the exposed shoreline where there wasn't much wildlife, I let him off to run around a bit. We'd been walking along the shoreline for maybe 45 minutes, finding nothing but a couple of interesting rocks and some old fishing lures, when Max started acting excited about something. He'd picked up a scent and was following it intently, nose to the ground, tail wagging like crazy. I noticed he was tracking what looked like raccoon prints in the damp, packed sand, clear as day. Those little handprint-looking tracks that raccoons leave. Drew was actually getting into it by this point, so we decided to follow Max and see where the raccoon tracks led. The prints headed away from the water toward a line of pines and aspens about 100 yards inland. We followed Max for about 20 yards when he suddenly got even more excited, darting forward toward an area where the sand looked all torn up. "Looks like he caught something," Drew said, jogging to catch up with Max. When we reached the disturbed area, it was immediately obvious that something had happened there. The sandy soil was churned up in a rough circle about 8 feet across. The raccoon tracks led directly into this area, and then nothing. They just stopped. But that wasn't what made my skin crawl. Starting from the tree line and leading to this disturbed spot were two sets of footprints. Not human footprints, not exactly, though that's what they resembled most. These were huge, barefoot impressions pressed deep into the soil. The biggest ones were enormous. I measured them later with my tape measure at nearly 17 inches long and almost 6 inches across at the widest part. And they were sunk a good 4 inches down into the packed sand. Running alongside these monster prints was a smaller set, still big by human standards, about 11 inches long and maybe 4 to 5 inches wide. These were pressed about 2 inches into the soil. Both sets came from the woods, led to the disturbed area where the raccoon tracks disappeared, and then returned to the tree line. "Dad, what the hell are these?" Drew asked, his voice cracking a little. He was trying to sound cool, but I could tell he was unsettled. "I don't know," I answered honestly, and I didn't. I'd been tracking deer and elk my entire life, and I'd never seen anything like these prints. What really struck me was how flat they were. Human footprints have an arch. These didn't. They looked almost like someone had pressed a giant, flat, foot-shaped cookie cutter into the sand. The toes were visible, 5 of them, but they weren't separated like human toes, more like bumps at the end of a wide, flat foot. I decided to test something. I stepped onto an undisturbed patch of the same sandy soil and pressed my boot down as hard as I could. I weighed about 180 pounds back then, and my footprint barely made a half-inch depression. Drew tried too. He was maybe 130 pounds, with similar results. Whatever made those tracks had to have been incredibly heavy or was applying tremendous downward pressure when it walked. The math just didn't add up for any animal I knew about, but it was Max's behavior that really sent chills down my spine. As soon as we reached that disturbed area, his entire demeanor changed. This dog, that would fearlessly chase after anything, suddenly tucked his tail between his legs and started whining. Not just a little whimper, but this high-pitched, continuous cry that made the hair on my neck stand up. Then he did something I'd never seen him do before. He urinated right where he was standing, then immediately defecated, which was weird because he was house-trained and always went off to do his business privately. But what happened next was even stranger. He started frantically pawing at the ground, trying to cover up his waist with sand, like a cat in a litter box. Max had never done anything remotely like that before or since. "What's wrong with Max?" Drew asked, looking genuinely scared now. "I don't know," I said again, feeling increasingly uneasy. "Let's get out of here." I tried to call Max to come, but he wouldn't. He kept circling that disturbed area, whining and occasionally stopping to paw at the ground. When I finally went over and picked him up, he was trembling all over, and he buried his head against my chest like he was trying to hide. That's when I noticed the smell. It's hard to describe, sort of a musky, wet dog odor, but stronger and with something else mixed in, something almost rotten. It wasn't overwhelming, more like the lingering scent of something that had been there recently but wasn't anymore. Drew had been taking pictures of the tracks with the digital camera I'd brought for photographing any artifacts we might find. I'm glad he did, because those photos are the only concrete evidence we have of what we saw. Unfortunately, they don't capture the depth of the impressions very well, but you can clearly see the size and shape. "Dad, do you think it's a bear?" Drew asked, but we both knew it wasn't. Bears don't walk on 2 legs for extended distances, and bear tracks look nothing like these. "Let's follow them," Drew suggested, a mix of fear and excitement in his voice, that teenage invincibility kicking in. "Absolutely not," I said firmly. Something in my gut was screaming that following those tracks into the woods would be a terrible idea. Max was still trembling in my arms, and I trust an animal's instincts way more than my own sometimes. We started walking back toward the shore, away from the tree line, but I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. It wasn't just paranoia, there was this palpable sensation of eyes on us. I kept looking back toward the woods, expecting to see, I don't know what. But there was nothing visible, just the dark spaces between the trees. About halfway back to our truck, I heard it. A sound from the direction of the forest that still haunts my dreams. It wasn't a howl or a screech or any of the animal sounds I was familiar with. The closest I can describe it is like a deep guttural exhalation that turned into something almost like speech, a whoop that modulated in pitch. It was loud enough to carry clearly across the distance, maybe 200 yards by then. Drew froze mid-step. What was that? Probably just an elk, I said, but we both knew it wasn't. I'd heard every sound an elk can make, and that wasn't one of them. Max started struggling in my arms, whining even louder. I put him down and immediately fastened his leash, afraid he might bolt in panic. Instead, he pressed against my legs, trying to hide behind me. "Let's pick up the pace," I said, trying to keep my voice calm for Drew's sake. We were walking quickly now, almost jogging, when we heard it again. That same vocalization, but this time it was answered by another, higher-pitched version of the same sound from a different part of the forest. They were communicating with each other. "Dad," Drew's voice was barely a whisper. "I know. Keep moving." We made it back to the truck without seeing anything emerge from the woods, but that feeling of being watched never subsided. As I started the engine, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. Something dark shifting between the trees at the forest edge, maybe 50 yards away. It was just a glimpse, nothing I could clearly identify, but it was big and it moved quickly, disappearing deeper into the trees. Drew saw it too. "Did you see that? Dad, did you see that?" "Yeah," I admitted, putting the truck in gear and pulling away faster than was probably safe on the gravel access road. "But I don't know what it was." Max finally started to calm down after we'd driven a few miles, but he still wasn't himself. He didn't even get excited about the beef jerky I offered him, which was unprecedented. Neither Drew nor I mentioned what had happened for the rest of the day. We went for pizza as promised, but we were both distracted, lost in our own thoughts. That night, Drew asked if he could sleep in the living room instead of his bedroom. He claimed he wanted to watch a late movie, but I knew he was unsettled. I didn't argue. The next morning over breakfast, we finally talked about it. "Those weren't human tracks, were they?" Drew asked. "No," I said. "I don't think they were." "So what were they?" I hesitated. "I don't know for sure." "You think it was, Bigfoot?" He said it half-jokingly, testing my reaction. I'd never been one for cryptid stories. I'd always rolled my eyes at the Sasquatch hunters with their blurry photos and wild claims, but after what we'd seen, I couldn't dismiss the possibility outright. "I think it was something I can't explain," I finally answered, "and I think we should probably keep this between us." Drew nodded, understanding the implications. In a small Montana community, being the guy who claims he found Bigfoot tracks isn't a reputation you want. We did go back to the same spot a week later, just the two of us, without Max. I don't know what I was hoping to find. Maybe confirmation that it had all been some misunderstanding, that there was a logical explanation. But a heavy rain had fallen in the intervening days and the area had been washed clean. The tracks were gone, the disturbed soil smoothed over. There was nothing left to see. I've spent countless hours researching since then, reading accounts of similar experiences, looking at track casts and photographs of alleged Sasquatch prints. Many of them share the characteristics of what we saw: the flat feet, the incredible depth of impression, the five-toed pattern without separated digits. What happened that day changed me. I'm not saying I know for certain what we encountered. Maybe there's some rational explanation I haven't considered, but I do know this. Something made those tracks. Something big walked on two legs out of those woods, intercepted that raccoon and returned to the forest. Something communicated with another of its kind. Something watched us leave. And whatever it was, my dog knew it was dangerous. Animals don't lie, and Max was terrified in a way I'd never seen before or since. I still go fishing at Canyon Ferry. I still hike in those woods. But I never go alone. I always carry bear spray, and I'm always aware of my surroundings in a way I wasn't before. And sometimes when I'm out there and the wind is still, I swear I can feel eyes on me from the tree line, watching, waiting, assessing. Drew's 29 now, with a family of his own. We still talk about that day sometimes, usually after a few beers when no one else is around. He's got the photos saved on an old hard drive, and occasionally he'll pull them out, and we'll look at them together, wondering. I don't know what we saw evidence of that November day in 2006, but I know it was real, and I know it's still out there, somewhere in the forests of Montana, living its life largely unseen, except for the rare occasions when it leaves behind a sign of its passing, like those 17-inch tracks pressed 4 inches deep into the sand. Story 8. I still get goosebumps every time I think about that night in the Dark Divide. It's been over 3 years now, but I can't shake it. I've been an avid mountain biker for 15 years, ridden some of the most challenging trails across the Pacific Northwest, but what happened in October 2020 changed me. My buddies Rob, Kevin and I had been planning this trip for months. We're all experienced riders who've tackled some serious terrain together over the years, but we wanted something different, somewhere truly remote. The Dark Divide roadless area in the southern Cascades seemed perfect. If you're not familiar with it, it's this massive stretch of wilderness in Washington state, with old-growth forests so dense the sunlight barely reaches the ground in some spots. The place is practically untouched, very few trails, almost no roads, just pure, ancient wilderness. We chose early October, thinking we'd catch the tail end of the good weather before winter set in. The forecast showed clear skies with cool temperatures, perfect riding conditions. We packed light, but brought enough supplies for 3 days, planning to explore some abandoned fire roads that Rob had found on old forestry maps. The drive out there was gorgeous. As we got deeper into the Cascades, the foliage was changing, all these incredible reds and yellows against the dark green of the massive firs and cedars. Cell service disappeared about an hour before we reached the trailhead, which was exactly what we wanted, a complete disconnect from the outside world. We parked at this tiny, overgrown lot where the pavement ended and unloaded our gear. The air had that crisp autumn smell, pine and earth, and that indescribable freshness you only get in old forests. We strapped on our packs, checked our GPS units, thank God we had those, and hit the trail around 11 in the morning. The riding that first day was incredible. The old fire road was challenging, roots, rocks, sections washed out by years of rain, but rideable. We climbed for hours, stopping occasionally to catch our breath and take in the views. The forest around us was massive, with trees so giant they seemed impossible. Everything was covered in a thick layer of moss, giving the whole place this prehistoric feel. We passed a few small streams, crystal clear and ice cold. By late afternoon, we'd climbed about 3,000 feet in elevation and decided to look for a campsite. Kevin spotted this clearing above what we later figured out was Cinnabar Creek, a perfect spot with enough flat ground for our 3 tents and a natural rock formation that would work as a fire pit. We set up camp with about an hour of daylight left. While Rob filtered water from the creek, Kevin and I gathered firewood. That's when I first noticed something odd. The forest was getting quieter. I've spent enough time outdoors to know that forests are never completely silent. There's always something, birds, small animals, insects, the rustle of leaves. But as the sun started to set, everything just stopped. No wind, no birds, no nothing. I mentioned it to Kevin, who shrugged it off, saying animals probably sensed the incoming cold front. That made enough sense, so I pushed the thought away. We finished setting up camp, got a solid fire going, and cooked some freeze-dried meals as darkness fell completely. We sat around the fire, swapping stories and sipping whiskey from Kevin's flask. The flames cast these long, dancing shadows into the surrounding trees. The silence was profound, but after a while, it started to feel oppressive rather than peaceful. I kept finding myself pausing in mid-sentence to listen for something, anything. Around 10:30, I remember checking my watch. We heard it. A small rock, maybe the size of a golf ball, landed with a soft thud about 10 feet from our fire. We all stopped talking and looked at each other. Probably just fell from somewhere, Rob said, but his voice had that forced casualness that told me he wasn't buying his own explanation. Less than a minute later, another rock, bigger this time, like a baseball, landed with a heavy thump near Kevin's tent. That's when the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. These weren't falling rocks, they were being thrown. "Hello?" I called out, feeling immediately stupid. We were miles from anywhere in a roadless wilderness. There shouldn't be anyone else around. Kevin grabbed his headlamp and shined it toward where the rocks had come from. Rob and I did the same, our 3 beams cutting through the darkness between the massive trees. The fog had started rolling in, giving the forest this eerie, dreamlike quality. Our lights reflected off the mist, limiting visibility to maybe 30 feet. That's when we heard the footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, heavy enough to crack twigs and compress the damp ground. And they were bipedal, left, right, with a rhythm that was unmistakably walking. But they weren't human steps. Each one was too heavy, too widely spaced. Whatever it was circling our clearing, staying just beyond the reach of our lights. "Bears don't walk like that," Kevin whispered, voicing what we were all thinking. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. Then came a sound I'll never forget, a deep, rumbling grunt that seemed to come from something with a chest much larger than a human's. It wasn't aggressive exactly, more like contemplative. We were all standing now, backs to the fire, headlamps sweeping the tree line. That's when it emerged from the fog. At first it was just a shape, a massive silhouette darker than the darkness around it. As it took another step forward, the firelight caught it better, and I felt my stomach drop. It was enormous, standing at least 8 or 9 feet tall, with shoulders twice the width of a large man. Its body was covered in dark, shaggy hair, not fur exactly, but longer, more human-like hair. Its proportions were what struck me most, unmistakably humanoid, but wrong. The arms hung much lower than they should, almost to the knees. Its legs were thick like tree trunks, and despite its size, it moved with an unsettling grace. I couldn't make out its face clearly in the dim light and mist, but I saw its eyes catch the firelight, reflecting back with a reddish amber glow. They were large, deep-set, and undeniably intelligent. We stood frozen, locked in this surreal moment that probably lasted only seconds, but felt like an eternity. Then, without any sudden movement, it simply turned and melted back into the forest. No one spoke for what seemed like forever. Finally, Rob broke the silence. "What the actual fuck was that?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "You both saw it too, right?" Kevin asked, his headlamp still fixed on the spot where the creature had disappeared. I nodded, not trusting my voice. We stayed by the fire, none of us willing to retreat to our tents. We spoke in hushed tones, trying to rationalize what we'd seen. A bear standing on its hind legs? No way. The proportions were all wrong, and bears don't move like that. A man in a suit? Out here, miles from nowhere? Impossible. We all knew what it looked like, but no one wanted to say the word. It seemed too absurd, too childish somehow. For the next hour, the forest around us came alive with sounds. Wood knocks, like someone taking a heavy branch and striking it against a tree trunk, came from different directions. Occasionally, we'd hear what sounded like whistles, not bird calls, but deliberate communications. Branches would snap suddenly, sometimes near, sometimes far away. We built the fire up as high as we dared, creating a circle of light that felt pathetically small against the vast darkness. None of us slept. We talked about packing up and hiking out, but the thought of navigating those trails in the dark with whatever was out there seemed even more terrifying than staying put. As the night wore on, the activity gradually subsided. By around 3 in the morning, the forest had returned to that unnatural silence. We took turns dozing while the others kept watch, but I don't think any of us actually slept. When dawn finally broke, it brought a thin, weak light filtered through morning fog and the dense canopy above. The forest looked beautiful again, ancient, serene, indifferent to our night of terror. But something had changed. I felt like we were being watched, even in the daylight. We cautiously explored the area around our campsite, and that's when we found the footprints. They circled our entire camp, sometimes coming within 15 feet of where we'd been sitting. The impressions in the soft forest floor were enormous, clearly barefoot with 5 toes, but measuring at least 21 inches from heel to toe. The depth of the prints suggested something incredibly heavy. Kevin's mountain bike, which he'd leaned against a tree, had been knocked over. The aluminum handlebars were bent, not broken, but visibly torqued, as if someone with immense strength had gripped them and twisted. But the most unsettling discovery came when we returned to our fire pit. In the center, where our fire had burned down to ashes, something, had placed a careful stack of rocks. Not small stones, but sizable rocks that would have required significant strength to move. They were arranged in a deliberate pyramid, the largest on the bottom, the smallest on top. None of us had done this. None of us could have done this without waking the others. We didn't speak much as we packed up camp. There was an unspoken agreement that we needed to leave immediately. I remember my hands shaking so badly I struggled to collapse my tent poles. Every few seconds I'd scan the tree line, expecting to see that massive silhouette again. The ride back was tense and fast. We didn't stop for breaks or to enjoy views. We just wanted to get back to the truck, back to civilization. The forest that had seemed so magical the day before now felt oppressive and alien. Every shadow between the trees could be hiding something. Every sound made us pedal faster. What stayed with me since that day wasn't just the fear, though that was profound. It was the realization that came to me as we finally reached the trailhead and loaded our bikes with shaky hands. We hadn't escaped something dangerous. We had been allowed to leave. The methodical rock throwing, the display of strength with Kevin's bike, the carefully arranged stones in our fire pit, none of these were random acts of aggression. They were calculated, intelligent behaviors, warning signs, boundary setting, communication. Whatever we encountered that night in the dark divide wasn't some mindless animal. It was thinking, planning, and making decisions, and it had decided to let us go. The 3 of us made a pact in the truck on the way home. We wouldn't tell anyone who might ridicule us. We wouldn't file reports that would bring attention and potentially danger to that creature. But we also agreed we would never, ever return to that part of the forest. I still mountain bike regularly. Rob and Kevin do too. But something changed for all of us after that trip. When I'm in the woods now, I'm more aware, more respectful. I understand now that there are places in this world where humans are merely visitors, not masters. Sometimes at night, I still hear that deep, rumbling grunt in my dreams. I see those intelligent eyes reflecting the firelight, and I wonder if it's still there in the dark divide, moving silently through its ancient domain, watching and waiting for the next humans who venture too deeply into its territory. I don't know what we saw that night. I don't have a name for it that doesn't sound ridiculous, but it was real, it was intelligent, and it's out there. Story 9. I've been meaning to write this down for a long time now. It's been 12 years, and I still find myself jolting awake some nights, feeling that same panic from back in March of 2011. My husband Ian and I were avid hikers. Hell, we met at an REI workshop on wilderness survival. We'd done dozens of multi-day trips all over the Pacific Northwest, including some pretty remote areas. Nothing fancy, just your typical hiking couple with decent gear who knew how to read a map and respected nature. The Hoh rainforest in Olympic National Park was familiar territory for us. We'd been there 3 times before, but never as early in the season as March. The place gets something like 12 feet of rainfall a year, and most of it seems to come down in winter and early spring. But we were eager to get back to the wilderness after being cooped up all winter, and the forecast showed a brief window where the rain might ease up. We planned a 4-day trek along the Hoh River Trail, going deeper than most day hikers venture. Ian had mapped out a route that would take us about 15 miles in, where we'd spend 2 nights at our furthest campsite before heading back. We packed light, but prepared for constant dampness, waterproof everything, extra socks, tarps, the works. The first day went exactly as expected. Drizzle, mud, and that incredible green you only get in temperate rainforests. Everything draped in moss, ferns sprouting from every surface. The trail was slick but passable, following the milky blue-grey Hoh River. We saw a few other hikers near the trailhead, but by late afternoon, we'd left everyone behind. We made our first camp at a designated site about 7 miles in. Nothing unusual happened that night, just the steady patter of raindrops on our tent fly and the distant rush of the river. We were tired and fell asleep quickly. The next morning, we continued upriver. The trail got rougher, with several fallen trees to clamber over and muddy slopes that made for slow going. The rain persisted as a light drizzle most of the day. By late afternoon, we reached our destination, a small clearing beside a tributary stream that fed into the Hoh. The spot wasn't an official campsite, but it was a flat area where others had clearly camped before, with a crude fire ring made of river rocks. We set up our tent efficiently, having done it hundreds of times. The rain had actually stopped for the first time since we'd started hiking, though water still dripped continuously from the towering Sitka spruces and hemlocks surrounding us. Ian managed to get a small fire going with dry wood he'd collected under fallen logs, and we heated water for our freeze-dried meals. I remember feeling completely at peace as we sat there on our little folding stools, wrapped in ponchos, sipping hot chocolate after dinner. The forest was coming alive with evening sounds, birds calling, the stream bubbling nearby, the occasional plop of water droplets hitting the forest floor. This was why we did these trips, to feel that connection with something ancient and alive. That's when we heard the first footfalls. At first, I thought it might be an elk or deer coming down to the stream to drink, but the cadence was wrong. Too deliberate, too heavy. The steps were slow, methodical, coming from somewhere in the tree line about 30 yards from our camp. Ian and I both froze, our eyes meeting over the small fire. Neither of us spoke, but I could tell he was hearing it too. The footsteps stopped. Then came a sound I'll never forget, a loud, resonant knock, like someone had taken a baseball bat to a hollow tree. It echoed through the clearing, unnaturally loud in the quiet forest. We waited, barely breathing, and then, from the completely opposite direction, 3 distinct knocks answered the first. "What the hell was that?" I whispered. Ian shook his head slightly. Probably woodpeckers, or maybe some branches falling. But we both knew it wasn't either of those things. Woodpeckers don't knock once and stop, and the responding knocks had come from too far away to be random branches. We sat in tense silence for another 20 minutes, but nothing else happened. Eventually, we convinced ourselves it was nothing to worry about and crawled into our tent for the night. I remember lying awake much longer than usual, straining to hear anything unusual. but only the normal forest sounds reached us. The next morning dawned grey and misty, but without active rainfall, a minor miracle in the Ho. We ate breakfast, packed our day packs, and decided to hike further upstream to explore before returning to the same campsite for our second night. In daylight, with the forest bright around us, the strange knocking sounds from the night before seemed less ominous. As we hiked, though, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something in the trees behind us. Ian admitted he felt it too, that prickly sensation at the back of your neck that triggers some ancient survival instinct. We spotted plenty of elk tracks in the muddy areas along the stream, some fairly fresh, but no actual animals. That struck me as odd because we'd always seen elk on previous trips to the Ho. The forest seemed unusually quiet, now that I think about it, fewer bird calls than I'd expect. We hiked about 4 miles upstream before turning back, reaching our campsite again as dusk approached. The rain had held off all day, which meant we could have another small fire. We cooked dinner, secured our food bag on a branch about 100 feet from our tent, standard practice in bear country, and settled in for the night around 8:30. I fell asleep quickly after the long day of hiking, but something woke me in the middle of the night. I checked my watch. It was just after 2 in the morning. For a moment, I couldn't figure out what had disturbed me. Then I heard it. Deep, heavy breathing just outside our tent. Not animal breathing, not a bear snuffling around. This was different, rhythmic, controlled, almost deliberate. I reached over and gripped Ian's arm. He was already awake, lying perfectly still beside me. Then came the shadow. Our tent was a pale green color, and even in the darkness of the forest night, you could see shadows moving against it if something passed between the tent and the faint ambient light. This shadow was massive, tall and broad, moving slowly along the side of our tent. I watched, paralyzed, as a large shape pressed against the nylon wall. I could make out the distinct outline of a hand, a fucking hand, with fingers spread wide, feeling along the fabric. The fingers were huge, much larger than any human hand, and I could see the thumb clearly separated from the other digits. The hand slowly moved down the side of the tent, then withdrew. "Ian," I breathed, barely audible. "Don't move," he whispered back. Whatever was outside our tent began moving around our camp. We could hear it rummaging through our things, the sound of branches being moved, our gear being shifted around. Our cooking pot clattered loudly as it was thrown against some rocks. It wasn't the random destruction of a bear looking for food. It felt purposeful, investigative. Heavy footsteps circled our tent deliberately. Each step made a deep impression in the soft ground. We could feel the vibrations. Occasionally, something would brush against the tent fabric, hard enough to make the poles sway. I was shaking uncontrollably, my hand clamped over my mouth to stay silent. The scariest moment came when the footsteps stopped right at the entrance to our tent. For what felt like an eternity, there was complete silence. Then came a deep, drawn-out grunt that seemed to resonate through my entire body. It wasn't a bear's grunt or any animal sound I'd ever heard before. It was deeper, more resonant, almost like a human sound, but not quite. After that single vocalization, the footsteps retreated. We listened as they grew fainter, moving back into the forest. Neither of us spoke or moved for at least an hour afterward, straining to hear any sign that it might return. Eventually, exhaustion overtook terror, and I must have drifted into a fitful sleep. I woke to grey dawn light filtering through the tent fabric. Ian was already awake beside me, his face pale and drawn. We looked at each other, and I saw my own fear reflected in his eyes. "We need to look," he said simply. We unzipped the tent with trembling hands and emerged into the morning mist. Our campsite looked like a small tornado had hit it. Our cooking gear was scattered in a 10-foot radius from the fire ring. The plastic tarp we'd laid under our supplies had been pulled out, and was hanging from a low branch. Our food bag, which had been secured about 7 feet up a tree, was on the ground, torn open. Oddly, nothing had been eaten. The contents were just strewn about. "My boot," Ian said suddenly, looking around frantically. One of his hiking boots was missing from where we'd left them outside the tent vestibule. We found it about 20 feet away, half submerged in the stream, as if it had been deliberately placed there. But the worst part, the part that still haunts my dreams, was behind our tent. In the soft earth were 4 enormous footprints, each nearly 19 inches long. They were clearly foot-shaped, with 5 toes, but massive, bigger than any human foot could possibly be. The impressions were deep, suggesting whatever made them was incredibly heavy. Neither of us said the word that was hanging in the air between us. We didn't need to. We packed up in record time, not bothering with breakfast or even coffee. Ian retrieved his boot from the stream, wringing it out as best he could before jamming his foot into the cold, wet leather. We were on the trail by 6:30 in the morning, moving as fast as the muddy conditions allowed. The feeling of being watched persisted the entire way out. Every crack of a twig or rustle in the undergrowth made us flinch. We didn't stop to rest, eat, or even fill our water bottles. 7 hours of hard hiking later, we emerged at the trailhead, both of us physically exhausted, but too amped up on adrenaline to feel it. The drive home was surreal. Ian gripped the steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles were white the entire 3-hour journey. I just stared out the window at the passing trees, half expecting to see something massive and dark step out from between them. We talked about reporting the incident to the park rangers, but ultimately decided against it. What would we say? That we heard strange knocking and something went through our campsite at night? They'd dismiss it as a bear encounter, and maybe that's all it was. Except I've seen bears in the wild before, and bears don't have hands. Bears don't knock on trees in call and response patterns. It's been 12 years now, and Ian and I still go hiking and camping regularly, but never again in the Olympic Peninsula, never again in the Hoh rainforest. We keep that water-damaged boot in our garage, warped and stained as a reminder. Sometimes, when we have friends over who notice it and ask about the odd placement, we exchange glances and tell them it's just an old boot we keep meaning to throw away. But we both know we'll never throw it away. It's evidence, tangible proof that something happened to us out there, something that science says doesn't exist, but that indigenous peoples throughout the Pacific Northwest have known about for centuries. I don't know what to believe anymore. I just know what I experienced, and I know that sometimes, when it's raining hard at night and the wind moves through the trees around our house, I find myself listening intently for a distinctive knock that would tell me it found us again. Story 10. I know most people won't believe what I'm about to share. Hell, I wouldn't believe it either if I hadn't lived through it myself. It's been 20 years since that night at Lake Pleasant near Forks, and I still get chills thinking about it. I've debated posting this for years, but after seeing similar experiences pop up, I figured someone out there might understand what we went through. It was July 2004. I'd just turned 31 2 weeks before, and my buddies Marcus and Jason had organized a weekend fishing trip as a belated birthday celebration. We'd been planning it for months, just 3 guys, a cooler full of beer, and some of the best fishing spots the Olympic Peninsula had to offer. Marcus had borrowed his uncle's 16-foot aluminum boat with a small outboard motor. Nothing fancy, but perfect for navigating the lake and getting to those secluded spots where the big fish lurk. We arrived at the lake Friday afternoon and spent most of Saturday catching decent-sized trout. The weather had been perfect, that rare Pacific Northwest weekend with clear skies, temperatures in the high 70s, and just enough breeze to keep the mosquitoes away. By Sunday evening, our last night there, we were feeling pretty good about the trip. We'd caught enough fish for several meals, drank about half the beer we'd brought, and enjoyed the kind of uninterrupted male bonding that becomes increasingly rare as you get deeper into adulthood. Marcus suggested we try a new spot for the evening session, a secluded cove on the northeastern side of the lake that he'd heard about from a local. According to him, the biggest trout in the lake congregated there at dusk. Jason and I were game, so we packed up our gear after an early dinner at camp and headed out around 7 in the evening. The cove was beautiful but isolated, surrounded by some of the densest forest I'd ever seen. Old-growth trees crowded right up to the water's edge, creating a wall of green that seemed impenetrable. The shoreline was rocky in some places, but mostly it was just vegetation that hung over and dipped into the water. No beaches, no clearings, just forest meeting lake with barely a transition. We positioned the boat about 15 yards from shore, close enough to cast toward the shadows where the big fish would be hiding, but not so close that we'd get snagged in the overhanging branches. The sun was starting to set behind the mountains to the west, casting long shadows across the water. There was that magical quality to the light you only get at dusk, not quite day, not quite night, when everything seems slightly enhanced. For about an hour, we fished in comfortable silence, occasionally breaking it to point out a bird or comment on a particularly good cast. The fishing was decent, not as spectacular as Marcus had promised, but good enough that no one was complaining. I'd caught 2 fair-sized rainbow trout, and Jason had landed a nice brown. Marcus hadn't caught anything yet and was getting a little competitive about it. It must have been around 8:30 when we first heard it. The sun had dipped below the mountains, but there was still plenty of light in the sky, that deep blue twilight that lingers forever in summer at that latitude. The first sounds weren't particularly alarming, just some cracking branches and rustling foliage from the shoreline about 50 yards to our right. Washington forests are full of wildlife, deer, elk, black bears, so hearing something moving through the underbrush wasn't unusual. But there was something about the pattern of movement that caught our attention. It wasn't the cautious, deliberate movement of a deer or the lumbering gait of a bear. It was forceful, almost aggressive, like something was pushing through the vegetation with purpose and power. "Probably a bull elk," Marcus whispered, not wanting to scare whatever it was. "They can make a racket when they're moving through thick stuff." Jason nodded in agreement, but I noticed his eyes were fixed on the shoreline, his fishing temporarily forgotten. I felt a strange uneasiness creeping up my spine, but tried to shake it off. I'd spent enough time in these forests to know that sounds can be deceiving, especially near water where they bounce and echo. We continued fishing, but all 3 of us were now casting with one ear tuned to the shoreline. The movement continued, parallel to the shore, heading in our direction. Whatever it was seemed to be following the contour of the lake, moving through that nearly impenetrable wall of vegetation with surprising ease. The sounds grew louder as it approached, branches snapping, undergrowth being crushed, an occasional thud that sounded like heavy footsteps. "That's a big animal," Jason muttered, reeling in his line. "Maybe we should move a bit farther out." Before either Marcus or I could respond, the movement stopped. The forest went completely silent, that unnatural quiet that sometimes falls in the woods when even the birds and insects seem to be holding their breath. We froze too, lines suspended, barely breathing. The stillness stretched for maybe 30 seconds, but it felt much longer. Then it happened. From the wall of green, no more than 40 yards from our boat, came a sound that instantly filled me with a fear I had never experienced before. It started as a low, rumbling growl that quickly rose into a high-pitched, piercing shriek that echoed across the water. It wasn't a sound I could associate with any animal I knew, not an elk bugle, not a cougar scream, not a bear's roar. It was primal and powerful and utterly alien. Marcus dropped his fishing rod. It clattered against the aluminum floor of the boat, the sound jarringly loud in the aftermath of that horrific vocalization. Jason's face had gone completely white, and I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape my chest. "What the fuck was that?" Jason whispered, his voice shaking. None of us answered because none of us knew. There was no reference point, no context for a sound like that in our collective experience of the natural world, and that's what terrified me the most, the utter foreignness of it. "Start the motor," I said to Marcus, surprised at how steady my voice sounded, despite the fear coursing through me. "Let's get out of here, now." Marcus didn't argue. He moved to the back of the boat, hands visibly trembling as he reached for the outboard's starter cord. Jason and I began reeling in our lines as quickly as we could, not caring about tangling the gear. Something primal had kicked in, a deep-rooted survival instinct that was screaming at us to flee. The creature in the forest started moving again, this time with even more force and speed. We could hear vegetation being pushed aside, branches breaking, the unmistakable sounds of something large and powerful moving parallel to us along the shoreline. Marcus yanked the cord once, twice, 3 times before the outboard sputtered to life. The noise seemed obscenely loud against the backdrop of twilight and fear. As he turned the boat away from shore, the creature let out another of those bone-chilling vocalizations, the same high-pitched, powerful shriek, but this time with an almost angry quality to it, as if our attempt to escape had enraged it. We began moving away from the shore, the small outboard pushing us across the glassy surface of the lake. A strange sense of relief washed over me as the distance between us and the shoreline increased. But it was short-lived. The crashing sounds in the forest continued, moving in the same direction we were headed, keeping pace with our boat. "It's following us," Jason said, his voice barely audible over the outboard's buzz. "That's impossible," Marcus replied, but his white-knuckled grip on the tiller told a different story. "We're moving at least 5 miles an hour." Yet the evidence was undeniable. The sounds of movement kept pace with us for about 200 yards before stopping. Then came another vocalization, that same terrifying shriek, but now slightly farther away. The creature had apparently changed direction, moving away from the lake and up into the densely forested hillside. We continued across the lake in tense silence, jumping at every wave slap against the hull. I kept my eyes fixed on the receding shoreline, half expecting to see something emerge from the trees, though the rational part of my brain was thankful for the growing distance. About a minute later we heard it again, that same shriek, but now coming from deeper in the forest, maybe a quarter-mile inland and uphill. It sounded farther away but no less powerful, carrying clearly over the water and through the evening air. "Jesus Christ," Marcus muttered, guiding the boat toward the opposite shore where our campsite was located. What the hell was that thing? None of us had an answer. We reached our campsite in record time, packed up our gear in near silence, and were on the road within 30 minutes. No one suggested staying the night as originally planned. No one wanted to be anywhere near Lake Pleasant once darkness fully settled. The drive home was quiet, each of us lost in our thoughts, occasionally breaking the silence to speculate about what we'd encountered. Bear? No, bears don't move that fast through thick vegetation, and they certainly don't make sounds like that. Cougar? Maybe, but the power behind the movement and vocalizations suggested something much larger. Some kind of unclassified wildlife? Possibly. But that part of Washington has been explored and studied for centuries. It seemed unlikely that a large, unknown animal species could remain undiscovered. We eventually settled on the explanation that it must have been an unusual combination of natural sounds. Perhaps a territorial animal combined with weird acoustics from the lake and hillside. It wasn't convincing, but it was more comfortable than the alternatives our minds were conjuring. For 2 years, I managed to file the experience away in that part of my brain reserved for unexplainable events. I didn't forget it, couldn't forget it, but I found ways to rationalize it, to blunt its impact on my day-to-day life. Marcus moved to California 6 months after the incident, and Jason and I gradually talked about it less and less, as if by mutual unspoken agreement. Then, in August 2006, everything changed. I was driving home from a late shift, somewhere in central Wisconsin, where I'd relocated for work. It was around 1 in the morning, and I was flipping through radio stations to stay awake on the empty rural highway. I landed on some late-night talk show where the host was interviewing a researcher about unexplained phenomena in the Pacific Northwest. I was only half listening, more focused on the road and staying alert, when the host played an audio recording. The moment the sound came through my car speakers, my entire body went cold. My hair literally stood on end, goosebumps erupted across my skin, and I felt tears spring to my eyes from the rush of adrenaline and fear that instantly flooded my system. It was the sound, the exact same vocalization we'd heard that night at Lake Pleasant. That distinctive, high-pitched, powerful shriek that had haunted my dreams for months after our fishing trip. I had to pull over. My hands were shaking too badly to drive safely. I sat there on the shoulder of that deserted Wisconsin highway, heart racing, breath coming in sharp gasps, as the researcher calmly explained that what I'd just heard was believed to be a Sasquatch vocalization recorded in the Olympic Peninsula in the late 90s. In that moment, everything we'd experienced crystallized into a new and terrifying clarity. The powerful movement through impossibly dense vegetation, the speed with which it had kept pace with our boat, the inhuman vocalization that seemed to combine strength and intelligence in a way no known animal could. We had been stalked by something that night, something that doesn't officially exist according to mainstream science, but something that was undeniably real in my experience. I've spent years researching since then, reading accounts from others who've had similar encounters. I found enough parallels to convince me that what we experienced wasn't unique or imagined. There's something out there in those deep, ancient forests of the Pacific Northwest. Something powerful, intelligent, and largely unknown. I've never returned to Lake Pleasant, and I doubt I ever will. Some places leave marks on you that never fully heal, opening doors to possibilities that can never be closed again. I still fish, still enjoy the outdoors, but never alone, and never in isolated areas as twilight approaches. Sometimes, on particularly quiet nights when the wind is still and the world seems to be holding its breath, I find myself listening, straining to hear a sound I pray never reaches my ears again. Because once you've heard it, once you know what's out there, you can never unhear it, you can never unknow it, and that's the most terrifying part of all. Story 11. I've never shared this publicly before. After all these years, I still get a knot in my stomach thinking about that day. It's not easy putting this into words, but I need to get it off my chest. Maybe someone else has seen what I saw. It was September 1976. I'm Gary Schmidt, and I was living in Red Deer, Alberta back then. I'd invited my buddy Peter Garriel up from Alabama for some grouse hunting along the Clearwater River near Caroline. Peter was an old army buddy, and we'd kept in touch over the years. He'd never been to Alberta before, and I promised him some of the best hunting he'd ever experienced. The morning started like any other hunting trip. We loaded up my old Ford pickup around 6 in the morning. The air had that crisp September feel, not quite winter, but you could sense it wasn't far off. I remember the weather was perfect that day. Clear blue skies, temperature around 50 degrees. Ideal hunting weather. We drove about an hour west of Red Deer, making small talk about our families, catching up on life since we'd last seen each other. Peter was telling me about his new job at a paper mill in Alabama. Normal conversation. Nothing about that drive suggested what we were about to experience. We parked at my usual spot, about half a mile from the river. I'd been hunting this area for years and knew it like the back of my hand. As we unloaded our gear, both of us carrying Remington shotguns, nothing fancy, I remember feeling excited to show Peter this piece of Alberta wilderness I loved so much. "You're gonna love this spot," I told him as we started walking through the trees. "Got 3 grouse here last time out." The forest was mostly lodgepole pine and spruce, with some aspen mixed in. The ground was covered with pine needles that muffled our footsteps. We were careful to move quietly, not wanting to scare off any game. The morning dew made everything smell fresh and earthy. We reached the river around 8:30. The Clearwater lived up to its name that day. You could see straight to the rocky bottom. It wasn't particularly wide at that spot, maybe 30 feet across, and only about knee-deep in most places. The water was moving pretty good, making that constant rushing sound that drowns out everything else. Our plan was to walk parallel to each other on opposite banks, about 200 yards apart, moving upstream. This way we could cover more ground and flush any grouse hiding near the water's edge. We'd done this plenty of times before. For the first hour or so, everything was completely normal. We spotted a couple of grouse, but they were too far for a clean shot. We kept moving. The sun was higher now, filtering through the trees and lighting up the river in patches of gold. Under any other circumstances, it would have been a perfect day. Around 10 in the morning, I was concentrating on a thicket where I thought a grouse might be hiding when I heard Peter calling from across the river. At first, I couldn't make out what he was saying over the sound of the rushing water. I looked up and saw him waving at me frantically. I cupped my hands around my mouth and yelled, "What?" He shouted back something that made no sense to me at first. "Are there apes in these mountains?" I remember thinking I must have misheard him. Apes in Alberta. I shook my head and gestured that I couldn't hear him properly. Peter started pointing downstream, urgently. He kept making these wide gestures with his arms. I squinted in the direction he was pointing, but couldn't see anything unusual from my angle. Trees, rocks, river, everything looked normal. I decided to cross the river to see what had gotten him so worked up. I found a shallow spot about 50 yards downstream and waded across. The cold water seeped into my boots, but I didn't care. Something about Peter's behavior had me worried. As I approached, I could see his face was pale. Peter wasn't the type to get spooked easily. We'd served together in Vietnam, and I'd seen him keep his cool in situations that would send most men running. "What is it?" I asked when I reached him. "Down there," he whispered, pointing downstream, "about 200 yards, by that big fallen log. Tell me you see that." I followed his gaze, and that's when my world shifted. Everything I thought I knew about the natural world changed in an instant. There, partially obscured by some low-hanging branches but clearly visible, was something I still struggle to describe accurately. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a moose. It wasn't any animal I'd ever encountered in all my years of hunting in Alberta. The creature was standing in the shallow part of the river where it bent around a small gravel bar. It was enormous. I'm 6 feet tall, and this thing towered over anything I'd ever seen. Had to be at least 9 feet tall, maybe more. Covered head to toe in thick, dark hair. Not fur like a bear, but hair, almost like a human's, but coarser and black as coal. But it was the proportions that were all wrong. Its arms hung down almost to its knees, massive things that looked powerful enough to uproot a tree. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, and strangest of all, it had almost no neck to speak of. The head just sort of sat directly on those massive shoulders. Peter and I stood frozen, neither of us speaking or moving. I was afraid to even breathe too loudly. My shotgun hung uselessly at my side. I never even thought about raising it. The creature was washing itself. That's the only way I can describe it. It was crouched down slightly, scooping water with its massive hands and rubbing it over its arms and chest. The movements were deliberate, almost human-like. Every now and then, it would shake itself slightly, sending water droplets flying from its hair. Its face was mostly turned away from us, but occasionally I caught glimpses when it would turn slightly. I've thought about how to describe that face for 45 years now. It wasn't human, but it wasn't entirely animal either. The snout was elongated somewhat, not flat like ours, giving it an almost dog-like appearance. But the eyes, When I caught a brief glimpse of them, they seemed intelligent, aware. That's what haunts me still. For what felt like an eternity but was probably about 5 minutes, Peter and I just stood there watching. Neither of us spoke. The rushing water of the river covered any sounds we might have made. The creature seemed completely unaware of our presence, just going about its business in the river. Then it happened, the moment that's burned into my memory forever. The creature suddenly stopped moving. It went completely still for a second, then slowly raised its head and looked directly in our direction. I don't know if it heard us somehow over the river noise, caught our scent on the breeze, or just sensed us watching. But in that moment I knew with absolute certainty that it saw us. Our eyes locked, mine and this impossible creature's, and I felt a chill run through me, unlike anything I've ever experienced. It wasn't fear exactly, it was more like recognition, like two sentient beings acknowledging each other's existence. I know that sounds crazy, but that's what it felt like. The moment lasted only seconds. Then, with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large, the creature turned and moved toward the tree line on the far bank. It didn't run exactly. It was more like a smooth, rapid loping motion. 3 or 4 massive strides, and it was at the edge of the forest. It paused for just a fraction of a second, looked back in our direction once more, then disappeared into the trees. The whole thing happened so fast that by the time I thought to reach for my camera in my backpack, it was already gone. All that was left was the disturbed water where it had been standing and some large, wet footprints on the gravel bar that were quickly disappearing as they dried in the sun. Peter and I stood in silence for what felt like minutes. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. When I finally looked at Peter, his face was a mixture of awe and disbelief, probably mirroring my own expression. "Did you?" he started, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," I nodded. "I saw it." "What the hell was that, Gary?" His southern accent seemed more pronounced in his shock. I shook my head. "I don't know." But deep down, I did know. Or at least, I knew what people would call it. Sasquatch. Bigfoot. The legend that old-timers and indigenous folks around here had talked about for generations. The thing I'd always dismissed as campfire stories. We debated going closer to where the creature had been, to look for footprints or hair or any evidence. But something held us back. Fear, maybe. Or respect. It felt like we'd intruded on something private, something not meant for human eyes. We didn't hunt anymore that day. Neither of us had the heart for it. We walked back to the truck mostly in silence, occasionally murmuring things like, "Did you see how big it was?" or "the way it moved?" But mostly we were lost in our own thoughts, trying to process what we'd witnessed. On the drive back to Red Deer, we made a decision not to tell anyone right away. Who would believe us? We'd sound crazy. Peter was flying back to Alabama in 3 days, and we agreed to think about it before sharing our experience. Those 3 days were strange. We'd be eating breakfast or watching TV, and suddenly one of us would say, "Its arms," or "the way it looked at us," and the other would just nod. We were both haunted by it, circling around the experience, unable to fully process it. After Peter went back home, I couldn't stop thinking about what we'd seen. It was affecting my sleep, my work. About 2 weeks later, I was listening to the radio when I heard a professor from the University of Calgary, Vladimir Makotic, on a talk show discussing Sasquatch research. I'd never called into a radio show before, but something compelled me to pick up the phone. I told him briefly about what we'd seen. He seemed genuinely interested, not dismissive like I'd feared. He asked if he could have a researcher contact me for a more detailed interview, and I agreed. That's how I met Thomas Steenberg. He came to my house about a week later, recorded our conversation, took detailed notes. He wasn't judgmental. He'd heard stories like mine before. That was almost more unsettling than the encounter itself. The idea that these creatures were out there, that others had seen them. I told Thomas everything, The location, the time of day, what the creature looked like, how it moved. As I spoke, I could see it all again in my mind, vivid as the day it happened. The strangest part was that even as I described it, I was aware of how impossible it all sounded. If someone had told me this story, I wouldn't have believed them. And that's exactly what happened when I made the mistake of mentioning it to a couple of friends over beers. The mockery was immediate. They didn't say it to my face, but I could tell they thought I was either lying or had mistaken a bear for something else. Word got around. At work, people would make jokes about me going Bigfoot hunting on the weekend. Someone left a plastic gorilla toy on my desk. My wife tried to be supportive, but I could tell she had doubts too. Maybe it was just a bear standing up, she'd suggest gently. The light plays tricks sometimes. But Peter and I knew what we saw. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person in a suit. It was something else entirely. I called Peter a few times over the next year or so. He was having similar experiences with people not believing him. Eventually, we stopped bringing it up, even with each other. Our calls became less frequent, focusing on family news and sports. The encounter became this unspoken thing between us. By the time Thomas Steenberg contacted me again for a follow-up interview years later, I was tired of the whole thing. I remember telling him, "You know, now I wish I never saw that thing. Nobody believes me, and so I just don't talk about it anymore." And I haven't really, not until now. It's been 45 years since that September morning. Peter passed away in 2013 from cancer, taking his half of our shared experience with him. I'm 72 now, and I find myself thinking about it more often. I've returned to that spot on the Clearwater River a few times over the decades. It looks different now. The fallen log is gone, washed away by spring floods years ago. The forest has changed too, some trees taller, others gone, but every time I stand there I can see it all again in perfect detail. The creature washing itself in the shallow water, those few moments of impossible contact between two different worlds. I know what I saw that day. I know it wasn't a bear or a moose or my imagination. Peter knew it too. There are things in this world that defy easy explanation, that exist in the spaces between what we know and what we don't know. I glimpsed one of those things on a clear September morning in 1976, and it changed me forever. I don't expect you to believe me. Most people don't. But it happened, exactly as I've described it. And somewhere in those mountains along the Clearwater River, I believe they're still out there. Watching, waiting, occasionally letting themselves be seen by people who aren't looking for them. I've never gone looking for another encounter. Once was enough. Some mysteries are better left alone. But I won't deny what I saw. Not anymore. Story 12. I've never really been someone who believed in Bigfoot or Sasquatch. I mean, I watched those shows on TV sometimes and thought they were entertaining. But I always figured if something that big was really out there, we'd have concrete proof by now. Well, that was until August 1984. Now, I'm not so sure what to believe anymore. My wife Jenny and I decided to go camping at the 7-mile recreation area in Alberta's Clearwater River region. We had been there once before, about 2 years earlier, and remembered it as a beautiful spot with decent fishing and not too crowded. I was working a stressful job at a lumber mill back then, and we both needed to get away from everything for a while. We arrived at the campsite around noon on a Friday. The weather was perfect, warm but not too hot, with a light breeze. After setting up our tent and organizing our campsite, we spent the afternoon fishing. Jenny caught 3 decent-sized trout, while I only managed one small one. She never let me hear the end of it, teasing me about how she was the better angler. We cooked the fish over our campfire for dinner, along with some potatoes and corn we had brought along. After dinner, as the sun started to set, I was feeling restless. Sitting around all day isn't really my style, even when I'm relaxing. I told Jenny I was going to take a walk to stretch my legs. "Don't go too far, bud," she said. "It'll be dark soon." I promised I wouldn't and grabbed my flashlight. though I figured I wouldn't need it since there was still plenty of light. The path I chose was a cut line that ran through the forest near our campsite. It was pretty wide and clear, bordered on both sides by trees of various heights. Some of them were just saplings, maybe 9 or 10 feet tall, while others towered at least 20 feet. The walk felt good. The air was cooler now, and the forest was starting to quiet down as day turned to dusk. I could hear the occasional bird call and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was peaceful and exactly what I had needed after months of the constant noise from the mill machines. I'm not sure exactly how far I walked, but if I had to guess, I'd say about 4 or 5 city blocks from our campsite. Far enough that I couldn't see our tent anymore, but not so far that I'd have trouble finding my way back. That's when things changed. I can't really explain it, but I suddenly got this feeling like I was being watched. You know that prickly sensation on the back of your neck? Like your body knows something's up before your brain figures it out? That's what it was like. At first I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just my imagination, or maybe a deer or some other animal watching me from the trees. But the feeling wouldn't go away. In fact, it got stronger. I stopped walking and stood still, listening carefully. The forest had gotten very quiet. No more bird calls, no chittering squirrels, nothing but the sound of the light breeze through the trees. Slowly, I turned and looked around, scanning the tree line on both sides of the cut line. That's when I saw it. Just inside the trees to my right, maybe 15 or 20 yards away, I could see what looked like a head and shoulders. But not like any animal I'd ever seen before. This thing was huge. The head was visible above trees that had to be at least 9 feet tall. Based on that, I'd guess whatever it was, stood about 12 feet high. My first thought was that it was a bear standing on its hind legs. But no, the proportions were all wrong. The head was more rounded, sitting directly on broad shoulders, and the coloring was off too, a dark brown, almost black. As I stood there, frozen in shock, it moved. Not toward me, thankfully, but sideways, parallel to the cut line. It took 3 to 5 steps, moving deliberately, before disappearing behind thicker vegetation. I couldn't see it anymore, but I could still hear it. Each footstep made a distinct thud against the forest floor. It wasn't moving quickly, but with slow, measured steps. The sound those footsteps made scared me more than the sight of the thing. Each thud suggested tremendous weight, like something far heavier than a person or even a bear. My heart was hammering in my chest. I knew I needed to get back to camp, but I was afraid to move. What if it decided to follow me? What if there were more of them? Eventually, self-preservation kicked in, and I started walking back toward the camp, trying to move quickly without actually running. I kept looking over my shoulder every few steps, terrified that I'd see that massive shape emerging from the trees behind me. The walk back seemed to take forever. Every rustle in the trees made me jump. By the time our campsite came into view, I was practically jogging. Jenny was sitting by the campfire reading a paperback novel. She looked up at me concerned. "You okay, bud? You look like you've seen a ghost." I didn't want to scare her. We were still spending the night there after all, and there was no way we could pack up and leave in the dark. So I lied. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just thought I heard something in the woods and spooked myself. You know how the mind plays tricks in the dark." She seemed to accept that, though she kept giving me worried glances throughout the evening. We sat by the fire for a while longer, but I couldn't relax. Every sound from the surrounding forest had me on edge. I kept looking into the darkness, half expecting to see that massive shape emerge from between the trees. When we finally went to bed, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake for hours, listening to every sound outside our tent. The normal nighttime forest noises, crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush, all seemed sinister now. Each crack of a twig had me wondering if that thing was out there, watching our camp. At some point, I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was filtering through the tent fabric. I felt exhausted, like I hadn't slept at all. Over breakfast, I finally told Jenny what I'd seen. I half expected her to laugh it off or tell me I was seeing things, but she didn't. She just listened, her face growing more serious as I described the size of the creature and the sound of its footsteps. "Do you think it was a Sasquatch?" she asked when I finished. I shrugged. "I don't know what it was. I've never believed in that stuff, but I know what I saw. And whatever it wasn't normal." We decided to pack up and head home after breakfast. Neither of us said it out loud, but I think we both felt uncomfortable staying there any longer. As we were loading up the car, a couple from the next campsite over came by to say hello. They introduced themselves as Mike and Carol, mentioned they were from Edmonton, and asked if we were leaving already. When I said yes, Mike nodded knowingly. "The wife and I heard something strange last night, real loud thuds, like something big walking through the woods. Woke us both up around midnight." I felt a chill run down my spine. So it had come back, maybe even approached our campsite while we were sleeping. I told Mike about what I'd seen, half expecting him to scoff, but he just nodded again. "My uncle, who works for the Forestry Service, says there've been similar reports in this area before. Not many, but enough to make you wonder." We finished packing up quickly after that. As we drove away from the 7-mile recreation area, I kept looking back through the rearview mirror, scanning the tree line. I didn't see anything, but that feeling of being watched stayed with me for miles down the road. It's been years now since that camping trip, but I still think about it often. I've never gone back to that specific campground, though I still enjoy camping in other areas. I've read up on Sasquatch sightings in Alberta, particularly in the Clearwater River region, and found reports similar to my experience. A massive bipedal creature observing from a distance and then retreating without aggression. I'm still not sure what I saw that evening. Was it a Sasquatch, some undiscovered species, or just a strange play of shadows and my imagination? The rational part of me wants to dismiss it, but then I remember the sound of those footsteps, the sheer size of the figure I glimpsed, and I know it was real. One thing bothers me more than anything else. Before that day, I was certain creatures like Sasquatch couldn't possibly exist without us having definitive proof. Now I'm not so sure. The forests of Alberta are vast and largely unexplored. There are places where humans rarely, if ever, set foot. Is it really so impossible that something could be living out there, watching us from the trees, choosing to remain hidden? I don't share this story often. Most people either don't believe me or think I'm exaggerating, but I know what I saw. And sometimes when I'm fishing alone or hiking through the woods, I still get that feeling on the back of my neck, that sensation of being watched, and I wonder if it's out there still, observing from a distance, keeping its secrets. The most unnerving part is the not knowing what exactly I saw, not knowing if it meant any harm, not knowing if, when I'm in the wilderness, I'm being watched by something that most people believe is just a myth. That uncertainty has stayed with me all these years, and I doubt it will ever completely go away. I've never had another experience like the one at 7-Mile Recreation Area. Part of me hopes I never do, but another part of me wishes for just one more glimpse, something that would confirm what I saw was real. Because living with the knowledge that something so extraordinary exists, but having no way to prove it, is its own kind of burden. All I know for certain is that something was in those woods that day in 1984, something massive and unknown. And sometimes, when I look out into the trees at dusk, I can't help but wonder if it's looking back. Story 13. I still get goosebumps thinking about that day in '79. My son and I were just taking what should have been a normal walk along the highway near Tay River Campground. It was early August, and we were camping at the Clearwater River area in Alberta for the weekend. Not our first time there. We'd been making summer trips there since my boy was little. He was 13 at the time of the incident. The weather was perfect that day. Not too hot, just warm enough for a light jacket in the morning. We'd had breakfast at our campsite, and I suggested we take a walk to stretch our legs before the day got too warm. My ex-husband had stayed behind to fix something on our camper, so it was just me and my son. We'd walked maybe 20 minutes from the campground, following the highway that runs alongside the river. The trees were thick on both sides of the road, but there were occasional breaks where you could see down to the water. We weren't talking much, just enjoying the quiet and pointing out birds to each other. My son was at that age where he didn't always want to hang out with his mum, so I was happy for the company. The highway wasn't busy, maybe one car every 15 minutes or so. There was that pleasant smell of pine and dust that I always associate with camping trips. I remember checking my watch. It was about 9:30 in the morning. We decided to walk for an hour total, so we were thinking about turning back soon. That's when I heard something behind us. It wasn't a car engine or anything I immediately recognized. It was a sort of shuffling sound, heavy footsteps on the asphalt. I turned around expecting to see another hiker or maybe someone from the campground. What I saw instead made my blood run cold. Standing there, just stepping onto the highway from the tree line, was something I still have trouble describing without sounding crazy. It was tall, at least 7 feet, maybe more, covered in dark brown hair or fur, not patchy but not super thick either, and it was walking on 2 legs, completely upright, not hunched over like a bear or anything else I could rationalize. I grabbed my son's arm instinctively, probably hard enough to hurt him, though he didn't complain. He turned too, and we both just froze. I remember thinking I should run, but my legs wouldn't move. It wasn't like the panic you feel when you're scared of something normal. It was deeper than that, like my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. The creature, and I hesitate to call it that because it sounds like I'm talking about a movie monster, but I don't know what else to say, was crossing the highway at a diagonal angle, coming from the riverside and heading toward the hill on the other side. Its stride was long but unhurried, almost casual. It moved with purpose, but not with any apparent fear or aggression. The most unsettling part, the detail that still makes the hair on my neck stand up when I think about it, is that it turned its head and looked right at us. Not a quick glance, but a deliberate look. I couldn't make out its facial features clearly from that distance, maybe 30 yards away, but I could tell its face was darker than the rest of its body, almost black, with deep-set eyes. Time seemed to stretch in that moment. I don't know if we stared at each other for 2 seconds or 20. Then, just as calmly as it had appeared, it continued across the highway, up the slight embankment on the other side, and into the trees. It never ran, never dropped to all fours. It just walked away like a person would walk, upright the whole time. After it disappeared, I realized I'd been holding my breath. My son and I stood there for what felt like forever, staring at the spot where it had entered the forest. Finally, I managed to whisper, "Did you see that?" He nodded, his face pale. "We need to go back to camp," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We turned around and started walking quickly back toward the campground. Neither of us wanted to run. Somehow that felt like it would make things worse, like running might trigger something to chase us. But we walked as fast as we could without actually breaking into a run. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see it following us, but the highway remained empty. The whole way back, my mind raced through possible explanations. A bear walking on its hind legs, but bears don't walk that far upright, and the proportions were all wrong. A man in a costume? Out here, miles from town, on a quiet morning in the middle of nowhere? It made no sense. When we got back to our campsite, my ex-husband could tell something was wrong. "What happened?" he asked. "You two look like you've seen a ghost." I opened my mouth to tell him, but then closed it again. How could I explain what we'd seen without sounding completely insane? I'd heard stories about Sasquatch or Bigfoot all my life, usually as jokes or campfire tales. I'd never believed they were real. But what else could explain what we'd just witnessed? We just got spooked by something in the woods, I said finally. Probably nothing. A deer or something. My son gave me a confused look but didn't contradict me. I gave him a small shake of my head when his father wasn't looking, a silent plea not to say anything more. That night, after my ex-husband had gone to sleep in the camper, my son and I sat by the dying campfire. "Mum, what was that thing?" he whispered. His voice had a slight tremor to it. "I don't know for sure," I admitted, "but it looked like, well, it looked like what people describe as Sasquatch or Bigfoot." "Should we tell someone?" I sighed. "Who would believe us? They'd think we were making it up or that we got confused about what we saw." "But we both saw it," he insisted. "I know, but people will still think we're crazy." We agreed not to talk about it again, at least not with other people. What was the point? We'd be laughed at, or worse, people would think we were attention seekers making up stories. The rest of our camping trip passed uneventfully, but I couldn't stop thinking about what we'd seen. I found myself scanning the trees constantly, jumping at every twig snap or rustle in the undergrowth. My ex-husband noticed my nervousness, but attributed it to usual camping jitters. I'd never been the outdoorsy type to begin with. We packed up and went home a day earlier than planned. I told my husband I wasn't feeling well, which wasn't entirely a lie. The encounter had shaken me more than I wanted to admit. For months afterward, I tried to convince myself we'd been mistaken. Maybe it was just a weird-looking bear. Maybe the morning light had played tricks on us, but deep down, I knew what we'd seen. The way it walked, the way it looked at us. It wasn't an animal, at least not any animal I knew of. But it wasn't quite human either. I might have kept this experience to myself forever if I hadn't overheard something at work about 6 months later. I was a receptionist at a small medical clinic, and I overheard 2 patients talking in the waiting room. One was a forestry worker who worked in the Clearwater River area. He was telling his friend about a close call he'd had on the highway near Tay River Campground. "Damn thing came out of nowhere," he was saying. "Nearly hit it with my truck. Biggest damn creature I've ever seen. Standing upright, covered in hair, looked me right in the eyes before it walked off into the trees." I felt like someone had doused me with ice water. I pretended to be busy with paperwork while I listened to him describe almost exactly what my son and I had seen, right down to the casual way it had walked off. His friend was laughing, clearly not believing him, but the forestry worker wasn't laughing. He had the same look in his eyes that I recognized from my own reflection after our encounter. That mixture of certainty and doubt, of knowing what you saw but questioning if you could trust your own perceptions. After his friend left to see the doctor, I approached him. "I couldn't help overhearing," I said quietly. "I saw it too. Last summer, with my son. Same place." He stared at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then, you know I'm not making this up." "I know," I said. "I've been afraid to tell anyone because I didn't want people to think I was crazy." "Same here," he admitted, "but I know what I saw." That conversation gave me the courage to finally report what we'd experienced. I contacted a researcher named Thomas Steenberg, who collected accounts of Sasquatch sightings. He listened without judgment and recorded every detail I could remember. My son eventually contacted him too, sharing his version of what happened. His account matched mine almost perfectly, except for one detail. He didn't remember the creature turning to look at us. He remembered it walking across the road and up the hill, but not that moment when it seemed to acknowledge our presence. That difference in our recollections sometimes makes me question my own memory. Did it really look at us, or did my frightened mind add that detail later? But no, I'm certain of what I saw. That deliberate turn of its head, that moment of connection. It's burned into my memory. It's been years now since that August morning at Tay River, but I can still picture every second of the encounter. The sunlight filtering through the trees, the quiet highway, the shock of seeing something that shouldn't exist walking calmly across my path. I've never gone back to that campground, and I don't think I ever will. I don't expect everyone to believe my story. I probably wouldn't believe it myself if someone else told it to me. But I know what I saw, and so does my son, and apparently so does that forestry worker. Something is out there in those woods, something that walks upright like a human but definitely isn't human. I remember reading somewhere that the Clearwater River area has had other Sasquatch sightings over the years. I guess it makes sense. Lots of wilderness areas, not too many people, but enough roads and campsites to create those moments where our worlds intersect. Those rare moments when the creatures most people think are just legends suddenly become very, very real. Sometimes I wonder if it thinks about us too, that creature from the highway. Does it remember the middle-aged woman and her teenage son standing frozen with fear as it crossed their path? Did it tell others of its kind about the strange encounter with humans? I still have so many questions. Was it male or female? Was it alone? Or were there others nearby in the trees? Why was it crossing the highway at that particular moment? Was it just coincidence that our paths crossed? Or was there some purpose to its appearance? I'll never know the answers. All I know is what I saw that day in '79, and it changed how I see the world forever. There are things out there that we don't understand, creatures that live alongside us but remain hidden most of the time. And sometimes, when you least expect it, on an ordinary morning walk along a quiet highway, the veil between our world and theirs lifts for just a moment, and nothing is ever the same again. Story 14. I've never been one to believe in those crazy Bigfoot stories you see on TV. Ghost stories, sure. UFOs, maybe. But Bigfoot, that always seemed like nonsense for gullible people who mistake bears for monsters. At least that's what I thought until April of 1969. What I saw that day in the wilderness near Lake Ribbon Creek changed everything I believed about what's possible in this world. I was 27 at the time, working at the lumber mill in Drayton Valley, Alberta. My buddies Tom and Keith had been planning this hunting and camping trip for weeks. Nothing fancy, just us guys getting away from our wives and jobs for a weekend to drink some beers, do some fishing, and hopefully bag a deer if we were lucky. The Lake Ribbon Creek area was gorgeous that time of year before the summer tourists arrived. The mountains still had snow on their peaks, but the valleys were starting to green up. Perfect weather, not too hot or cold. We'd set up our camp about a mile from where we parked the truck, hauling our gear through some pretty rough terrain. We weren't total amateurs. We'd all grown up in Alberta and knew our way around the wilderness. Tom was the most experienced outdoorsman among us, having worked as a park ranger for a few years before joining the mill. Keith was my brother-in-law, married to my sister Sarah for about 5 years by then. We'd done these trips together maybe a dozen times before. That morning we'd been up since dawn, hiking along some game trails and setting up a few fishing lines. By midday, we were starving. Tom had caught 2 decent-sized trout, and we had them cooking over the fire along with some beans and bacon. The smell was amazing after hours of hiking. We were sitting there on some logs, passing around a thermos of coffee, talking about work and complaining about our bosses. It was Keith who noticed it first. We'd been eating for maybe 30 minutes, just bullshitting and enjoying the quiet. Keith suddenly stopped mid-sentence and squinted toward the tree line across the small clearing from our camp. At first, I thought he'd spotted a deer or maybe even a moose. "Guys," he whispered, not taking his eyes off whatever he was looking at. "What the hell is that?" I followed his gaze, and my stomach instantly knotted up. About 100 yards away, partially hidden in the shadows of some massive pine trees, was something. My first thought was bear, but within seconds I knew that wasn't right. This thing was sitting on its haunches, almost like a person would sit, observing us with an intentness that sent shivers down my spine. "Is that a gorilla?" Tom whispered, his voice tight with disbelief. It did look like a gorilla, massive shoulders covered in dark hair or fur. but there was something distinctly un-gorilla-like about it too. The proportions were wrong. Its head sat directly on those massive shoulders with barely any neck visible, and it was just watching us. Not moving, not foraging, just staring. Keith immediately stood up, nearly knocking over his plate. "We need to get back to the truck, now." His voice was shaking. I started to rise too, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. But Tom put his hand on my arm. "Wait," he whispered. "Don't make any sudden moves. Let's just see what it does." "Are you insane?" Keith hissed. "That's not a normal animal." He was right. Whatever we were looking at, it wasn't something that belonged in the Canadian wilderness. It was too big for a bear from that distance. We estimated later it must have been 7, maybe 8 feet tall. And the way it sat, the way it watched us, there was an intelligence there that made my skin crawl. For what felt like forever, but was probably about 5 minutes, we just stayed frozen in place, staring at it while it stared back at us. I remember the silence most vividly. The usual forest sounds had completely stopped. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just the soft crackling of our campfire and our own ragged breathing. Then it stood up. I'll never forget that moment as long as I live. It rose up on 2 legs, smoothly and without effort. Standing upright, it was even more imposing, broad across the chest and shoulders, covered in dark brown, almost black hair that hung several inches long all over its body. And there was something else I noticed. Something that made this encounter even more bizarre. It appeared female. From that distance, I could make out what looked like long, drooping breasts hanging from its chest. "Jesus Christ," Keith whispered, and I could tell he was fighting the urge to run. That's when it made the noise. A rapid chattering sound, like teeth clicking together, but loud enough that we could hear it clearly from that distance. At the same time, it started moving its massive arms up and down, not frantically but deliberately, almost like it was trying to communicate something. The whole thing lasted maybe 10 seconds. Then, without any apparent hurry, it turned and walked away into the deeper forest. Not on all fours like a bear or gorilla would do, but upright, on 2 legs, with a smooth, rolling gait that was eerily human-like, yet distinctly not. We stood there in stunned silence for what felt like minutes after it disappeared from view. Tom was the first to speak. "Did that really just happen?" he asked, his voice barely audible. I couldn't answer. My mind was frantically trying to rationalize what we'd seen. A bear standing on its hind legs, some kind of escaped zoo animal. But I knew those explanations didn't fit what we'd witnessed. "We need to go check," Tom said finally, reaching for his rifle. "Check what? Are you crazy?" Keith looked at Tom like he'd lost his mind. "We need to pack up and get the hell out of here. We need to see if it left any tracks," Tom insisted. "Otherwise, who's going to believe us?" He was right about that. Even I was struggling to believe what I'd seen, and I'd been staring right at it. Without evidence, this would just be another campfire story that nobody would take seriously. After some heated, whispered arguments, we decided to approach the spot where the creature had been sitting, but only after arming ourselves. Tom had his hunting rifle, I took my shotgun, and Keith grabbed the axe we'd brought for chopping firewood. We moved slowly, staying close together, constantly scanning the trees around us. It took us about 5 minutes to reach the spot. The ground there was covered with pine needles and forest debris. We searched carefully, looking for footprints, hair, anything that might confirm what we'd seen wasn't a collective hallucination. But we found nothing, no tracks, no broken branches, no sign that anything had been there at all. "The ground's too dry and hard here," Tom said, disappointment evident in his voice. "And these pine needles, they spring back up after being compressed. Or maybe we imagined the whole thing," Keith suggested, though I could tell from his face he didn't believe that. "No way all 3 of us imagined the same thing," I said. We spent another 15 minutes searching the area before giving up. As we walked back to our camp, I kept looking over my shoulder. half expecting to see that thing watching us again from behind a tree. The forest that had seemed so peaceful that morning now felt threatening, full of hidden eyes. Back at camp, we debated what to do next. Keith wanted to leave immediately. Tom, ever the outdoorsman, argued that the creature hadn't shown any aggression. It had just observed us and moved on. I was torn. The logical part of my brain wanted to dismiss the whole thing, but I couldn't shake the image of that creature standing upright, making that chattering noise while moving its arms. In the end, we compromised. We wouldn't cut our trip short, but we'd move our camp closer to the truck, just in case we needed to make a quick getaway. We packed up our gear in record time, hardly speaking as we worked. The usual jokes and banter were gone, replaced by tense silence and frequent glances toward the tree line. That night, at our new campsite, we sat around the fire and tried to make sense of what we'd seen. Tom had brought a notebook, and we attempted to sketch the creature while the details were still fresh in our minds. None of us were artists, but the drawing we came up with captured the essential features. The massive shoulders, the relatively small head set low between them, the long arms, and yes, those pendulous breasts that suggested we'd encountered a female of whatever species this was. "It has to be what people call Sasquatch," Tom said finally, staring at our crude drawing. "Or Bigfoot. Nothing else makes sense." "Except that Bigfoot isn't real," Keith countered, though without much conviction. "Then what the hell did we see?" I asked. Nobody had an answer to that. We spent 2 more nights in the woods, but the remainder of our trip was ruined. We jumped at every sound, kept our weapons close, and barely slept. We didn't see the creature again, but somehow its absence was almost worse than another encounter would have been. I kept imagining it watching us from just beyond the firelight, waiting. When we finally packed up and drove home on Sunday evening, there was an unspoken agreement between us about what we would tell people. We decided to reach out to John Green, a journalist and researcher who'd been collecting Sasquatch reports. At least he wouldn't laugh us off immediately. We sent him our account along with the sketch we'd made. Back in Drayton Valley, life went on. I returned to my job at the mill, paid my bills, kissed my wife, and tried to put the whole thing behind me. But I couldn't. That creature, the way it moved, the way it watched us with such obvious intelligence, had fundamentally shifted something in my understanding of the world. Tom and Keith and I didn't talk about it much after that initial report. What was there to say? We had no proof, no evidence beyond our shared experience. Keith eventually moved his family to Edmonton for a better job, and we lost touch. Tom and I still worked together at the mill, but whenever the topic came close to that day at Lake Ribbon Creek, one of us would change the subject. It's been over 50 years since that day, and I've never spoken publicly about what we saw. Who would believe me? An old man telling stories about monsters in the woods. But I know what I saw. Sometimes at night, I still hear that chattering sound in my dreams, see those arms moving up and down in that deliberate pattern. I've looked through primatology books, trying to understand if it was some kind of communication. I've read every Sasquatch report I can find, looking for similarities. Some accounts describe similar behavior. Sasquatch observing humans from a distance, sometimes making sounds, sometimes gesturing. I've wondered many times over the years, was it trying to communicate with us? Was it warning us away from its territory? Or was it simply curious about these strange creatures invading its home? I'll never know. But I do know this. The wilderness is vaster and more mysterious than most people realize. There are remote valleys in those mountains that maybe no human has ever set foot in. Is it really so impossible that something like what we saw could exist there, rarely encountered, highly intelligent enough to avoid detection? Before that day, I would have said yes, impossible. Now, I'm not so sure. All I know is that three sober, rational men saw something that spring day in 1969 that shouldn't exist, according to science. And 50 years later, I still can't explain it. I've never gone back to Lake Ribbon Creek. Never wanted to. But sometimes I wonder if it's still there, watching from the shadows as hikers and campers pass through its territory, making that strange chattering sound with its teeth, moving its arms up and down in a language no human understands. Story 15. I've never really told this story outside of my immediate family. I guess after all these years, I still find it hard to explain what we saw that day. It's been 56 years now, but the memory hasn't faded one bit. If anything, it's only become clearer with time. It was August of 1968. I was 12 years old and my family was on our annual summer road trip through the Canadian Rockies. My dad, Gerald Martin, had this old Ford station wagon that he'd practically rebuilt himself. He was so proud of that car. Mum was in the passenger seat with the map spread across her lap, and my older sister Catherine and I were in the back, arguing over who got to use the binoculars next. Dad had planned this trip for months. He worked for the forestry department and had a thing for wilderness areas. The Columbia Icefields was our main destination that summer. He'd been talking about it non-stop for weeks before we left. The largest ice field in the Rocky Mountains of North America, he kept saying. The way he described it made it sound magical. The drive up Highway 93 was something else. I remember pressing my face against the window, looking up at those mountains. They were massive, like nothing I'd ever seen before. The peaks disappeared into the clouds, and there were patches of snow, even though it was the middle of summer. We'd been driving for hours that day. Catherine and I were getting restless in the back seat. You know how kids get on long road trips. Dad had promised we'd stop soon to stretch our legs and take some pictures. Mom had packed sandwiches and thermoses of hot chocolate, even though it was summer. In the mountains, she always said, you never knew when you might need something warm to drink. The Columbia Icefields came into view suddenly as we rounded a bend in the highway. I still remember gasping at the sight. It was this enormous expanse of white and blue ice stretching between the mountains. Dad pulled over at a viewpoint and we all piled out of the car. The air was crisp and cool, even though it was August. I remember shivering a little and wishing I'd brought my sweater. Dad got his camera out, one of those old Kodak models with the flash bulbs. Mum was busy getting the picnic stuff organized on a nearby table. Catherine grabbed the binoculars first, as usual, and started scanning the ice fields. "Can I have a turn?" I asked, after she'd been hogging them for what felt like forever. "In a minute," she said, not even looking at me. "I'm trying to see if there are any mountain goats." I was about to complain to Mom when Dad called us over. He'd set up his tripod and wanted to take a family picture with the ice fields in the background. We all stood there, Mom telling us to stand up straight and smile. Dad set the timer and jogged over to stand with us. The camera clicked and Dad went back to check it. That's when I noticed Catherine had left the binoculars on the picnic table. I grabbed them before she could come back and claim them again. I was just happy to finally get my turn, so I started scanning the mountains randomly, not really looking for anything in particular. The binoculars were heavy, Dad's good pair that he used for work. I remember struggling to adjust the focus ring with my small hands. I was panning across the ridge east of the highway, opposite the ice fields, when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a shadow moving along the ridgeline, but then I adjusted the focus, and I could see it was something solid, something big, something walking on two legs. "Dad," I called out, not taking the binoculars away from my eyes. "There's something up there." "What is it, honey?" he asked, not really paying attention as he fiddled with his camera. "I don't know. Something big. It's walking." That got his attention. He came over, and I handed him the binoculars, pointing to where I'd seen the figure. His whole body tensed up when he spotted it. "Mary," he called to my mum. Come look at this. Mum came over, followed by Catherine, who was annoyed I'd taken her binoculars. Dad handed them to Mum without saying anything. She looked through them for a long moment. "What am I looking at, Gerald?" she asked. "Ridgeline about halfway up, moving left to right," Dad said quietly. Mum gasped. "Is that a person?" "Too big," Dad said, "and moving too fast for the terrain." By now, Catherine was practically hopping with curiosity. Mum handed her the binoculars. I was getting frustrated because I couldn't see anything without them, and nobody was explaining what was going on. "Holy cow," Catherine whispered when she found it. "Let me see again," I demanded. Dad took the binoculars from Catherine and handed them back to me. "Keep your eye on that ridgeline," he instructed, pointing. It took me a minute to find it again, but then I saw it clearly. It was big and black, moving along the ridge on two legs. It wasn't a bear. I knew what bears looked like, even at a distance. Bears don't walk upright for that long. This thing was walking like a person, but was all wrong. Too big, too bulky. Its arms were long, swinging slightly as it moved. "What is it, Dad?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer right away. He took the binoculars back and watched for a while longer. Then he said something to Mom that I couldn't hear. She looked scared and started gathering up our picnic things. "Kids, get in the car," she said, her voice tense. "But what is it?" Catherine asked. "I don't know," Dad said slowly. "But it's not a person, and it's not a bear." I remember feeling a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Dad kept watching through the binoculars while Mom hustled us back to the station wagon. I didn't want to go. I wanted to keep watching the thing on the mountain. It was scary, but fascinating too. "Gerald," Mom called, her voice sharp with worry. "We should go." Dad lowered the binoculars but didn't move toward the car. "It's so far away," he said. "It can't possibly see us or get to us from there." "I don't care," Mom said. "I don't like it." Dad finally turned away from the ridge and started packing up his camera equipment. I could tell he was reluctant to leave. Dad was always curious about wildlife. His job with the forestry department meant he spent a lot of time tracking and observing animals. But this had him rattled, I could tell. We all got back into the station wagon, but Dad didn't start the engine right away. Instead, he pulled out his work notebook and started writing. "What are you doing?" Mom asked. "Making notes while it's fresh in my mind," he replied. "Size, movement pattern, coloration." "What do you think it is?" Catherine asked from the back seat. Dad didn't answer right away. He finished writing, then turned to look at all of us. "I don't know for sure," he said finally. "But I've heard stories from the old-timers. The indigenous guides I've worked with, they talk about something they call Sasquatch." "Bigfoot," Catherine said, her voice a mix of fear and excitement. "For real?" I didn't know much about Bigfoot then. I'd seen headlines in those tabloid newspapers at the grocery store checkout, but Dad never let us read those. He said they were full of nonsense. "I don't know," Dad repeated. "But whatever it is, it's not something I've seen before, and I've been in these mountains for 20 years. Mom was getting more anxious by the minute. "Gerald, can we please go now?" Dad nodded and started the car, but instead of pulling back onto the highway, he turned off the engine again and reached for the binoculars. "Just one more look," he said. We all sat in silence as Dad scanned the ridge again. "It's still there," he said after a minute. "Moving along the ridge line. It seems to know exactly where it's going." "Can I see again?" I asked. Dad hesitated, then handed me the binoculars. "Look where I was pointing." I found it again easily this time. The black figure was still moving along the ridge, but it had covered a lot of ground. It was moving fast, which seemed impossible given the rough terrain. I knew from our hikes how difficult it was to navigate those rocky slopes, but this thing was moving like it was on a sidewalk. As I watched, it suddenly stopped. My heart nearly stopped too. It seemed to turn in our direction. I couldn't make out any facial features. It was too far away, and the binoculars weren't powerful enough. But I had the distinct impression it was looking right at us. "Dad," I whispered, "I think it sees us." Dad took the binoculars back quickly. He watched for a few seconds, then lowered them slowly. "Start the car, Gerald," Mom said, her voice tight. Dad didn't argue this time. He started the engine and pulled back onto Highway 93. I turned in my seat to look out the back window, but the ridge was already out of sight as we rounded a bend. No one spoke for a long time. The only sound was the hum of the tires on the pavement and the occasional static from the radio as Dad tried to find a station. Finally, Catherine broke the silence. "Was that really Bigfoot?" "I don't know what it was," Dad said carefully, "but it was something unusual." "It was walking on two legs," I said, "like a person." "Yes," Dad agreed. "But no person could move that fast over that kind of terrain. And the size was all wrong. Even from that distance, I could tell it was big, much bigger than a man. Could it have been some kind of bear?" Mom asked hopefully. Dad shook his head. "Bears don't walk upright for that long, not at that speed. And the proportions were wrong for a bear. This had long arms, a relatively small head compared to its body." He trailed off, and I could tell he was thinking hard about what we'd seen. "Why didn't you take a picture?" Catherine asked suddenly. Dad sighed. "I wish I had. It just happened so fast, and by the time I realized what we might be looking at, I was more concerned about watching it than photographing it. The telephoto lens was in the trunk anyway." I remember feeling disappointed about that. A picture would have been proof, something to show people, something to look at later and confirm what we'd seen. We drove in silence for a while longer. I kept thinking about the figure on the ridge, how it had moved, how it had seemed to spot us from so far away. I kept getting this weird feeling in my stomach every time I thought about it looking our way. "Are we going to tell anyone?" I asked eventually. Dad glanced at Mom, and something passed between them. "I don't know, buddy," he said. "People might not understand." "They'll think we're crazy," Catherine said bluntly. "Not crazy," Dad corrected. "But without evidence, it's just a story. And strange stories make people uncomfortable." I nodded like I understood, but I didn't, not really. I just knew we'd seen something incredible, something that most people never get to see, and we were probably going to keep it a secret. We stopped for dinner at a small restaurant in Jasper a few hours later. Dad had this map spread out on the table, trying to pinpoint exactly where we'd been when we saw the figure. "The eastern ridge above the Columbia ice fields," he murmured, tracing his finger along the map. "Extremely remote area, no hiking trails, difficult terrain. Perfect place for something to hide," Catherine said with a shiver. Mom gave her a look. "Don't scare your brother." But I wasn't scared, not anymore. I was fascinated. "Do you really think it was a Sasquatch, Dad?" He folded the map carefully before answering. "I think it was something science hasn't properly documented yet," he said finally. "Something that's managed to stay hidden because it's smart and it knows the mountains better than we do." That night at the motel, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing the figure in my mind, moving along that distant ridge. I wondered what it was doing now, in the darkness. Was it sleeping in a cave somewhere? Was it still roaming the mountains? Did it have a family? Dad must have noticed I was awake because he came and sat on the edge of my bed. "Can't sleep?" he asked softly, trying not to wake Catherine in the next bed. I shook my head. "Still thinking about what we saw today?" I nodded. Dad ruffled my hair. "Me too," he admitted. "Are you going to report it?" I asked. "To the forestry department or someone?" He sighed. "I've been thinking about that. The thing is, without evidence, it would just be filed away as an unverified sighting, and honestly, it might affect how people at work see me." they wouldn't believe you. Some might. Others would think I was seeing things or making it up. But we all saw it, I protested, all four of us. I know, buddy, but that's still just eyewitness testimony. In science, that's considered one of the weakest forms of evidence. I thought about that for a minute. So we're just going to keep it a secret? Not a secret exactly, but maybe just something we keep in the family for now, until we decide what to do. I nodded, though I felt a little disappointed. Seeing a Sasquatch seemed like the kind of thing you should tell people about. Try to get some sleep, Dad said, patting my shoulder. We've got a long drive tomorrow. But sleep was a long time coming. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of dark figures moving silently through mountain forests, always just out of clear sight. The next morning at breakfast, Dad made us all promise not to talk about what we'd seen with anyone outside the family. Mom agreed immediately. Catherine rolled her eyes, but promised too. I reluctantly gave my word as well. As we continued our road trip over the next week, we occasionally talked about it among ourselves. Dad had this theory that these creatures, if there were more than one, probably had specific routes they followed through the mountains. Safe pathways that kept them away from humans, but allowed them to cover large distances. That would explain why it was on that ridge, he said, as we drove through Banff National Park a couple days later. High ground gives a tactical advantage. You can see without being seen. Except we did see it, Catherine pointed out. Only because we happened to have binoculars and were looking in exactly the right place at the right time, Dad replied. What are the odds of that? I've thought about those odds a lot over the years. What were the chances that I would grab those binoculars at exactly the right moment and look in exactly the right direction? Sometimes I think it was just luck. Other times I wonder if maybe it wanted to be seen. Dad kept his word about not reporting it officially, but over the years I know he talked to a few trusted colleagues about what we saw. He would sometimes come home excited because someone else had reported something similar in the same general area. As I got older, I did my own research. I read everything I could find about Sasquatch sightings in the Canadian Rockies. There were more than I expected, though few as clear as what we saw that day. Most were just glimpses through trees or unusual footprints found in remote areas. Dad passed away 12 years ago. Mum followed 3 years later. Catherine lives in Toronto now with her family. We don't talk about that day much anymore, but we all remember it. Sometimes when we get together at Christmas, after a few drinks, one of us will bring it up. Remember that thing we saw at the Columbia ice fields? And we'll all go quiet for a moment, thinking back to that August day in 1968. I went back there once, about 15 years ago. Stood in almost the same spot where we'd parked the station wagon. The view was just as spectacular, but I didn't see anything moving on that ridge, even though I'd brought a much better pair of binoculars than Dad had back then. I've never seen anything like it again, though I've spent a fair amount of time in the mountains over the years. But I know what I saw that day. We all do. Something large, dark, and moving upright with purpose across terrain that would challenge an experienced hiker. Something that didn't belong in the conventional understanding of North American wildlife. I'm 68 now, much older than Dad was when we saw it. I've told my kids the story, and they humored me, but I could tell they were skeptical. I don't blame them. Without seeing it yourself, it's hard to believe, but I know what I saw. And sometimes, when I'm out hiking and the forest goes quiet in that strange way it sometimes does, I find myself scanning the ridgelines, wondering if I'm being watched by something that knows exactly how to stay hidden, except for those rare occasions when, for whatever reason, it allows itself to be seen.